Welcome back to the dark. It is a comfort to know that while we listen alone in the quiet of our rooms, we are actually gathered here together from all corners of the world. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a note in the comments telling me where you are listening from tonight. It is always grounding to see how far our circle extends, stretching across oceans and time zones, all united by a shared curiosity for the shadows. Now, wherever you are, make sure you are safe and warm. Unclench your jaw. Let your shoulders drop. We are leaving your city behind now and traveling to the American South, to a story of youth and betrayal. In the heart of Tennessee, hidden from the light of ordinary days, stands a prison that holds one of the youngest women ever condemned to capital punishment in America. Her name is Christa Pike, and though the walls are thick and the guards are many, those who have met her say she is not quite human anymore. This is the story of how she came to be there, a tale that begins long before the night she took her life, in a childhood of shadows and hunger, and ends in a cell where she waits for a reckoning that has been promised for nearly 30 years. Deborah K. Johnson, Rehabilitation Center, sits off a busy highway, the kind of road where travelers pass without looking, their eyes fixed on destinations farther down the line. It is a place designed to be forgotten, a building that holds what society has decided it cannot keep. The windows are narrow, the doors are steel, and behind them, in a cell measured not in feet, but in the slow passage of years, Christa Pike waits. She has been waiting since 1996. That is nearly 3 decades of concrete and fluorescent light, of meals passed through slots and conversations conducted through barriers. Most who receive such a sentence would be broken by now, worn down by the weight of time and the certainty of what awaits. But those who know Christa Pike say she is not like most. She is something different, something colder. Detective Randy York, who investigated her crime, speaks of her with a careful distance, the way one might describe a storm or a fire, something powerful and fundamentally indifferent to human suffering. He has seen terrible things in his career, homicides that carved themselves into memory and refuse to leave. But Christa Pike, he says, stands apart, not because of what she did, though that was horrific enough, but because of what she is, a person who seems to lack the very mechanisms that make us hesitate, that make us feel. Others who encountered her use different words, but they all circle the same unsettling truth. She is manipulative, they say. She knows how to be charming, how to draw you in with a smile that seems genuine until you realize, too late, that there is nothing behind it. A chameleon, one person called her. Sneaky, sly, able to shift her shape to fit whatever the moment requires. She can make herself small and vulnerable, or bold and defiant. She can laugh like a child, or stare with eyes that hold no warmth at all. Kim, who was once her best friend, remembers a whimsical ball of fire someone who would walk up a hill just to bring candy when you were sick, someone who made you feel seen and cared for. But Kim also remembers the moment that illusion shattered, the night Christa returned from the woods and told her story with a smile, bragging about what she had done, as if it was something to be proud of. That was when Kim understood. The friend she thought she knew had never really existed, or perhaps she had, but only as a mask, worn when it served a purpose. The crime itself was particularly violent, even by the standards of homicide. It lasted 45 minutes. Those who investigated it say 45 minutes in which a young woman named Colleen Slemmer fought for her life in the woods near Tyson Park, begging for mercy that never came. The medical examiner lost count of the stab wounds. Over 300, perhaps more. When it was over, Christa Pike reached down into the blood and took a piece of her victim's skull, a fragment of bone that she carried back to Job Corps in her jacket pocket like a trophy. That piece of skull became a symbol not just of the crime, but of something deeper and more disturbing. It spoke to a mind that did not simply end a life in rage or fear, but did so with intention, with pleasure, with the desire to possess and remember. Christa Pike was a Satanist, investigators discovered. Her room held altars and literature, symbols carved and drawn, a small devil tattooed on her chest. She believed, or claimed to believe, that Colleen's passing was a ritual offering, marked by the pentagram carved into the girl's skin while she still lived. At 18 years old, Christa Pike became one of the youngest women ever sent to Capital Punishment Row in the United States. The jury took 9 minutes to recommend her execution. 9 minutes, which included an hour for lunch. They saw no reason to deliberate longer. The evidence was clear. The crime was undeniable. And the defendant, sitting in the courtroom, seemed almost amused by the proceedings, waving at acquaintances and giggling with her attorney, as if the trial were a performance put on for her entertainment. But even on the row could not contain the violence within her. In 2001, she attempted to end the life of a fellow inmate named Patricia Jones, wrapping a shoelace around her neck and choking her until guards pulled them apart. Patricia Jones was not an easy target. She was a violent woman herself, convicted of stabbing an elderly woman to her end, someone you would not want to cross. But Christa Pike crossed her anyway, and nearly succeeded in ending her life. When asked about it later, she spoke freely, almost cheerfully. "You should have heard her gurgling," she said. She was convicted again, this time of attempted first-degree homicide, and received an additional 25 years on top of her sentence. It made little difference. She was already condemned to perish. What was another sentence to someone who believed she had nothing left to lose? Over the years, other stories emerged. Guards spoke of her ability to manipulate, to charm, to convince people to violate their oaths and risk their careers for her. 2 correctional officers became involved with her. one romantically, the other conspiring to help her escape. One had made a copy of a cell key and was planning to free her when the plot was discovered. Both were fired. Both had fallen under her spell, seeing in her something that was not really there, or perhaps seeing exactly what she wanted them to see. Psychologists who have studied her case use terms like psychopathy and grandiosity, superficial charm and lack of empathy. They speak of a person who exists without the internal constraints that govern most human behavior. Someone for whom other people are not quite real, not quite worthy of consideration beyond their usefulness. It is a clinical way of describing what others sense instinctively when they meet her, that there is something missing, some essential part of being human that she was born without or lost along the way. Christa Pike grew up in North Carolina, in a home where alcohol was more common than food, where her mother's boyfriends became predators, where safety and love were words without meaning. She was violated repeatedly, abused in ways both physical and psychological, bounced from parent to grandparent, never finding solid ground. Some say this explains to her that the child who suffers such things cannot help but become monstrous. Others say it only provided the kindling. The spark, they argue, was already there. Mae Martinez, the mother of Colleen Slemmer, does not care about explanations. She has lived with the absence of her daughter for nearly 30 years now. She has attended court hearings and appeals, has fought to keep Christa Pike on the row, has held Colleen's picture in her hands and promised that she will be there when the execution finally comes. She will hold that picture up, she says, so that Christa can see the face of the girl she took from this world, so that in her last moments she might feel something, anything, resembling remorse. But those who know Christa Pike doubt she ever will. In interviews conducted from prison, she has shown no regret, no understanding of what she took from the world when she ended Colleen Slemmer's life. She speaks instead of hope, of belief that she does not deserve to be where she is. When asked about the electric chair, she smiles and says she does not think about it because she does not believe she will ever see it. It is a strange kind of faith, built not on innocence, but on a conviction that the rules somehow do not apply to her. A date for her execution was supposed to be set in 2020, but the world changed and the date was delayed. She remains on the row, confined 23 hours a day to a cell designed to hold the worst that humanity produces. She is unique in Tennessee, the only woman awaiting execution in the state. There is no one else quite like her. And so the years continue to pass, slowly, inexorably, each one carrying Mae Martinez farther from the daughter she lost, and Christa Pike closer to the end that has been promised. The prison sits off its highway, holding its secrets and its monsters. And inside, behind steel and stone, Christa Pike waits, unchanged, unrepentant, believing still that she is somehow special, somehow different, somehow deserving of more than what fate and justice have decreed. The question that haunts all who know her story is not whether she will perish, but whether she will ever understand why. Long before she became known as one who takes lives, Christa Pike was a child. And like all children, she was shaped by the world around her. But the world she knew was one of hunger, violence, and shadows that moved in the night. North Carolina is a state of rolling hills and vast countryside, where the land stretches green and wide beneath open skies. It is a place that appears, from a distance, gentle and forgiving. Small towns dot the landscape, connected by quiet roads that wind through forests and farmland. Churches rise white and simple against the horizon. Families gather on porches in the evening heat. It is the kind of place where childhood should be safe, where memories should be made of summer days and fireflies caught in jars. But Christa Pike's childhood was not like that. Behind the doors of her home, a different world existed, one that bore no resemblance to the pastoral beauty outside. It was a world measured in absences. The absence of food when hunger gnawed, the absence of safety when night fell, the absence of a mother's protection when it was needed most. Her mother was there in the physical sense. She occupied space in the house, moved through rooms, and spoke words. But presence and care are not the same thing. Christa's mother was never really there in the way a child needs. She was absent in all the ways that matter, never present except to be angry, to yell, to add to the chaos rather than calm it. A child learns quickly to read the mood of a house, to sense when danger is near. And in Christa's home, danger was always near. There was alcohol, always alcohol, bottles that appeared and emptied, voices that grew louder as the night wore on, the smell of it hanging in the air like something sour and permanent. The cupboards, by contrast, were often bare. A child who opens a cabinet hoping for food and finds only emptiness learns a particular kind of despair. It is not dramatic. It is simply a hollowing out, a quiet understanding that no one is thinking of you, that your needs do not register in the minds of those who should care. Christa's mother had many men. Some became husbands for a time. Others simply passed through, leaving their marks in different ways. The parade of male figures created an instability that never allowed Christa to find footing. Just as she might grow accustomed to one presence, he would be gone, replaced by another. And some of these men, perhaps many of them, saw in a young girl not someone to protect, but someone to prey upon. The violation began early. Her mother's boyfriends, men who should have been kept far from a child, instead had access to her. They violated her repeatedly in a home where her mother either did not know or did not care enough to stop it. Later, when the full scope of what happened to Christa became known, people would point to this as the root of her darkness. But it was not simply that the abuse occurred. It was that it occurred and nothing followed. No intervention, no care, no treatment. When a child suffers trauma, the wound can sometimes heal if it is properly tended. There must be someone who sees the pain, who names it, who helps the child understand that what happened was not their fault. There must be safety afterward, and love, and the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust. But Christa received none of this. The abuse happened, and then life simply continued as before, as if nothing had changed, except everything had changed. Something inside her had been altered, perhaps permanently. She was bounced from parent to parent, then to grandparents, never staying anywhere long enough to feel rooted. Each move was another uprooting, another message that she was a burden, something to be passed along when the current caretaker grew tired of dealing with her. Children need consistency, stability, and the assurance that they will not be abandoned. Christa learned the opposite lesson, that people leave, that no one can be trusted to stay, that she was fundamentally alone. Her mother even involved her in her own vices. They smoked marijuana together when Christa was very young, a grotesque parody of bonding, a mother sharing her escape with a daughter who should have been shielded from such things. It blurred lines that should have remained clear, erasing the boundary between adult and child, between protector and dependent. A child in such circumstances learns that the normal rules do not apply, that the world operates on principles foreign to what should be. The combination of neglect and abuse, of instability and violation, created something toxic in Christa's psychological development. The human mind, especially a young one, is remarkably adaptable. It will reshape itself to survive whatever environment it finds itself in. But sometimes those adaptations, necessary for survival in childhood, become maladaptive in adulthood. Sometimes they create patterns of thinking and feeling that are fundamentally incompatible with living peacefully among others. Psychologists who later studied Christa's case would speak of attachment disorders, of developmental trauma, of the ways early abuse rewires the brain's capacity for empathy and connection. They would note that she never learned to see other people as fully real, as deserving of consideration and care. She learned instead that people are dangerous, that they will hurt you if given the chance, that the only safety lies in being harder, colder, more willing to strike first. She also learned, perhaps most dangerously, that she was not valued, that her pain did not matter, that she could be hurt, and the world would simply continue turning, indifferent to her suffering. This creates a particular kind of rage, one that simmers quietly beneath the surface, waiting. It is not the hot anger that flares and fades. It is something colder, more patient, more willing to wait for its moment. Some who knew her later would say that Christa Pike was simply born evil, that no amount of trauma could excuse what she became. Others would argue that the child she was born as never had a chance, that the abuse and neglect shaped her into something she might not have become otherwise. The truth, as it often does, likely lies somewhere between. Perhaps she came into the world with certain predispositions, certain vulnerabilities that under different circumstances have remained dormant. And perhaps the childhood she endured activated those tendencies, nurtured them, turned them into something monstrous. What is certain is that by the time Christa Pike reached her teenage years, the damage was done. She had learned lessons about the world that most people never learn, and having learned them, she could not unlearn them. She had adapted to survive a childhood of horrors, and those adaptations would follow her into adulthood, shaping every relationship, every decision, every moment of violence that was yet to come. At 18, she dropped out of school. There was nothing keeping her in North Carolina, no ties strong enough to hold her. The place that should have been home had never felt like one, and so she left, carrying with her all the accumulated damage of her young life, all the unhealed wounds and unresolved pain. She moved to Tennessee, to a city called Knoxville, where a government program promised second chances to young people who needed them. It was meant to be a fresh start, an opportunity to learn a trade, to build a different kind of life than the one she had known. The program was designed for people like her, people who had suffered, who had fallen through the cracks, who needed help finding their way. In another story, it might have worked. She might have found healing there, or at least stability. She might have learned that not everyone would hurt her, that trust was possible, that there were other ways to be in the world. But Christa Pike did not go to Knoxville seeking redemption. She went carrying her past like a weight she could not set down, like a shadow that had become part of her. And in that city, at that Job Corps Center, surrounded by other troubled young people with their own scars and stories, something would finally break. The rage that had been building for 18 years would find its target. And a young woman named Colleen Slemmer, who had traveled from Florida with hope in her heart, would pay the price for all the things that had been done to Christa Pike long before they ever met. At 18, Christa Pike arrived in Knoxville, Tennessee, a city nestled at the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. It was a place where young people came seeking second chances. But for Christa, it would become the stage for something far darker. Knoxville in the 1990s was a city in transition, growing fast, stretching outward and upward as if trying to shake off its past and claim a future. It lay in the eastern part of Tennessee, where the land begins to rise toward the ancient mountains that gave the region its name. The Smokies loomed in the distance, their peaks often wrapped in the blue-gray mist that had earned them their title. a constant presence on the horizon, beautiful and indifferent. The city itself had always carried a strange quality, an undercurrent that residents recognized but rarely named aloud. Odd things happened in Knoxville, they would say. Not the ordinary crimes and troubles that plague any American city, but stranger occurrences, events that seem to resist easy explanation. It was not a large place like Atlanta or Nashville, not a metropolis with the anonymity that size provides. It was smaller, more contained, the kind of city where news traveled quickly and everyone seemed to know someone who knew someone else. But it was growing. Throughout the 90s, Knoxville expanded in all directions, filling in the spaces between its old neighborhoods with new construction, new commerce, and new energy. Colleges dotted the landscape, bringing young people from across the region and beyond. Little cafes opened their doors, places where students and locals could sit outside in the warm Tennessee evenings, drinking coffee and talking about nothing important. The streets were alive with pedestrians, with the hum of conversation, with the feeling that something was happening here, that the city was becoming something more than it had been. People walked everywhere in those days, moving between shops and restaurants, meeting friends on street corners, eating dinner at outdoor tables. There was a sense of possibility in the air, the optimism that comes when a place is on the cusp of transformation. The Strip, as locals called it, was the heart of this activity, a stretch of Cumberland Avenue where the young and restless gathered, where energy and ambition mixed with the simpler pleasure of just being out in the world. It was into this environment that Christa Pike arrived, carrying with her all the weight of her 18 years. She came to join the Job Corps program, a government initiative designed to offer vocational training to young people who had, for whatever reason, fallen behind. The program had noble intentions. It sought out those who had struggled in traditional schools, those who came from difficult home situations, those who simply needed another path forward. The Knoxville Job Corps Center occupied a building on Dell Avenue that had once been a Holiday Inn. It was a repurposing that spoke to the pragmatic nature of the program, taking what already existed and transforming it into something new. The building rose 5 stories, its rooms converted from hotel accommodations into dormitories for students. It was not luxurious, but it was functional, a place where young people could live while they learned trades that might carry them into stable employment. Some came to study nursing, learning the skills that would allow them to care for the sick and elderly. Others pursued business clerical work, mastering typing and filing and the administrative tasks that kept offices running. Still others went into building trades, learning carpentry and electrical work and plumbing, the physical skills that built and maintained the infrastructure of modern life. The program offered room and board, covering the basic needs of students who often came from situations where such needs had not been reliably met. Joe Mode worked at the Knoxville Job Corps Center From 1992 through April of 1995, he taught many subjects during those years, including cultural awareness, reading, and parenting skills. He believed in what the program was trying to do, believed that young people deserved second chances, that circumstances of birth should not determine the trajectory of an entire life. The students ranged in age from 15 to 22, sometimes even older, young adults who, for various reasons, had not followed the traditional path through high school and into college or career. At its best, the program worked. Joe saw students who arrived uncertain and left confident, who discovered abilities they had not known they possessed, who went on to build lives they could be proud of. The center held perhaps 350 students at any given time, a small community within the larger city, young people from across the region all gathered in one place, all seeking something better than what they had left behind. But somewhere along the line, something shifted. The philosophy began to change, or perhaps the reality of the program simply caught up with its ideals. Troubled youth, those who had committed criminal acts, began to be funneled into Job Corps as an alternative to incarceration. The thinking was understandable. Why lock young people away when they could instead be given education and training, a chance to redirect their lives before they became hardened criminals? It seemed merciful, forward-thinking, a belief in rehabilitation over punishment. In practice, however, it created problems. The students who came genuinely wanting to learn, who were there by choice and ambition, found themselves surrounded by others who had been sent, who were there under compulsion rather than desire. Harassment became common. Good students, the ones who studied hard and followed the rules, were often jumped, beaten up, their belongings stolen. The atmosphere grew tense, sometimes dangerous. Joe watched as bright students, ones who had shown real promise, left the program rather than endure the harassment. It was heartbreaking, he would later say, to see young people who wanted to succeed driven away by those who had no interest in being there, who brought with them the violence and chaos they had known on the outside. The program that was meant to offer second chances began to feel more like a holding facility, a place where troubled youth were warehoused rather than helped. Knoxville itself, for all its growth and optimism, sat in the heart of the Bible Belt. Churches rose on nearly every corner, their steeples pointing skyward, their congregations gathering each Sunday to worship and pray. Faith was woven into the fabric of daily life here, an assumption rather than a choice. People spoke of God and church the way they spoke of weather and work, as simply part of what was. This made the city, in many ways, deeply conservative, traditional, rooted in values that had been passed down through generations, which meant that when darkness appeared, when something transgressive emerged, it stood out all the more starkly against the background. Satanism was not common in Knoxville. It was not something people discussed or acknowledged. If there were those who practiced it, they did so in secret, knowing that such beliefs would mark them as outsiders, as threats to the moral order that the community maintained. The symbols and rituals of occult worship, the inversion of Christian imagery, the embrace of what the churches called evil, all of this was so foreign to Knoxville's culture that it seemed almost unreal when encountered. But it was there, hidden in the margins, practiced by a small number of students at Job Corps who found in its imagery something that spoke to their anger, their alienation, their desire to reject the values of a world that had rejected them. They carved pentagrams into notebooks, read literature that glorified darkness and rebellion, held themselves apart from the mainstream students with a pride that bordered on defiance. Most dismissed them as troubled kids playing at being dangerous, trying on an identity that made them feel powerful in a world where they had little power. The Job Corps Center on Dell Avenue became, in those years, a place of strange convergences. Young people seeking genuine improvement mixed with those sent there as punishment. Bible Belt values bumped up against occult practices. Hope and violence occupied the same hallways, the same dormitory floors, the same cafeteria tables. It was an unstable mixture, volatile, waiting for a spark. And into this environment came Christa Pike, carrying her trauma and her rage, her charm and her darkness. She enrolled in the nursing program, presenting herself as someone who wanted to learn, who wanted to build a different life. And for a time, perhaps she even believed it herself. But the weight she carried was too great, and the cracks in the Job Corps system too wide. In a place meant for healing, something terrible was about to take root. In that troubled place, Christa Pike found something she had never truly known before: friendship. Her name was Kim, and for a time, they were inseparable. But friendship, like all things in Christa's life, would be touched by darkness. Within the grey corridors of the Job Corps Center, where the air often carried the weight of heavy histories and uncertain futures, a connection was formed that seemed on the surface to be the simplest of things. It began not with a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration, but with the quiet gravity of two young lives drifting toward one another in a sea of strangers. Kim had arrived at the center, as many did, looking for a harbor in a storm. She was 16 years old, possessed of a heart that was still open to the world, and a spirit that had not yet been hardened by the complexities of the adult world. It was a day like many others in Knoxville, with the sun perhaps casting long shadows across the pavement of Dell Avenue, when she first encountered Christa. Kim was sitting outside, perhaps seeking a moment of peace, away from the crowded 5 floors of the converted hotel, when Christa walked over. There was no hesitation in Christa's stride, no doubt in her eyes. She looked at the younger girl and asked a question that would change the trajectory of both their lives. "Can I sit here?" Kim looked up, saw a face that seemed mirrored in its own search for belonging, and replied with a simple, "Yep." And that, as Kim would later remember, was the end of it. From that moment on, they were no longer solitary figures navigating a difficult path. They were a pair. Their closeness developed with the rapid, intense rhythm that only the young truly understand. They lived 5 doors apart in the residence hall, a distance that in the world of the Job Corps felt like no distance at all. They shared the same classes, sat at the same desks, and walked the same halls. When the structured hours of the day gave way to the freedom of the late afternoon, they would sign themselves out and step into the city of Knoxville together. From 4 o'clock until 10 o'clock in the evening, the world outside the center became their playground. They would board the free trolley buses that hummed through the streets, riding the iron rails toward the Strip, where the lights of the cafes and the energy of the college town provided a backdrop for their shared laughter. Hardly anybody had any money in those days. They were students of the state, living on hope and the modest stipends provided by the program. But for Kim and Christa, the lack of currency was a minor detail. They had time, and they had each other. They would spend hours just hanging out, talking about everything and nothing, watching the people go by and feeling, perhaps for the first time, that they were not invisible. Christa was, in Kim's eyes, a whimsical, fun ball of fire. She was the one who filled the silence with laughter, the one who turned a mundane walk into an adventure. She was a girl who seemed to vibrate with a restless, bright energy, an energy that Kim found intoxicating and comforting all at once. In those early months, Christa's kindness felt absolute. It was a tangible thing, expressed in gestures that seemed to come from a place of deep, protective care. Kim remembers a time when she was sick, confined to her room while the rest of the world moved on outside. Christa did not merely send a message or offer a passing word of sympathy. Instead, she traveled all the way up the huge hill that flanked the center, a climb that was steep and taxing, just to fetch candy for Gaga, her friend. She returned breathless and smiling, presenting the small gift with a simple declaration. "Just so you feel better. Love you." It was the kind of devotion that builds a wall of trust, brick by brick. For a 16-year-old girl who had known her own share of troubles, such a friend was more than a companion. She was a sanctuary. But the brilliance of Christa's light was also a mask. The chameleon, as we have observed before, does not change its colors to express itself, but to hide itself. As they sat together on the trolley or walked beneath the neon signs of the Strip, Kim could not see the cracks in the foundation of her best friend's mind. She did not know that the girl who brought her candy was the same girl who carried a meat cleaver and a box cutter in her thoughts. She did not see the yawning void that sat just behind the whimsical laugh. To Kim, Christa was a protector, a sister by choice, a ball of fire that kept the cold at bay. The innocence of their bond was real to Kim, but for Christa, It was perhaps another way to occupy a world that she intended to master. There were small warning signs, of course, fractures in the narrative that Kim was too young and too loyal to understand. There were moments when Christa's intensity would shift from warmth to something sharper, something more possessive. Her love was not a soft thing. It was a tight, demanding force. She went out of her way to make Kim feel special. But in doing so, she was also ensuring that Kim's world revolved around her. It was a subtle architecture of manipulation, built so slowly that it felt like affection. In the troubled environment of the Job Corps, where harassment and minor violence were common, Christa's strength felt like a shield. Kim leaned into that shield, grateful for the protection, unaware that the shield was also a cage. They remained inseparable as the winter of 1994 turned toward the new year of 1995. They were two girls against the world, dreaming of nursing careers and lives beyond the 5 floors of the Dell Avenue Hotel. Christa would often tell Kim that she loved her, a phrase that carried a heavy, sacred weight in their friendship. To Kim, it was a promise of safety. To the universe, it was a dark irony. As they rode the trolley back to the center each night, signing back in before the 10 o'clock curfew, the rhythm of their lives felt steady and secure. They would return to their rooms 5 doors apart and sleep with the quiet confidence of those who believe they have found their best friend. Kim was the conscience of this story, the witness who saw the whimsical fun ball of fire before it became a conflagration. Her perspective is essential because it reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with a snarl or a shadow. Sometimes it arrives with candy and a smile. Sometimes it walks up a steep hill just to make you feel better. The tragedy of their friendship was not that Kim was naive, but that she was human. She saw the light because Christa wanted her to see the light. She loved the friend because Christa had mastered the art of being the friend. The 16-year-old girl could not have known that her best friend was a predator in waiting, or that the laughter they shared was the prelude to a scream. As the days grew shorter and the mountain air turned brittle with frost, the circle of their friendship began to expand, bringing in new faces and new desires. A young man named Tadderall Ship would soon enter the scene, and the simple, inseparable bond between the two girls would be tested by the introduction of a dark, possessive hunger. Christa's focus began to shift, and the whimsical light began to take on a reddish, flickering hue. Kim remained by her side, a loyal shadow, but the ground beneath them was no longer as solid as it had seemed on the day they first sat together outside. The trolley continued its rounds. The college students continued to walk the strip, and the Job Corps Center continued to hold its 350 souls in an uneasy embrace. But the innocence of those early months was fading, replaced by an impending sense of change that Kim felt in the pit of her stomach, but could not name. She watched her best friend, the the girl she loved and saw only the ball of fire. She did not see the cold ash that was already beginning to fall. While the two friends shared their secrets in the quiet hours of the night, another girl was moving through the same hallways. She was sweet and mild-mannered, a quiet presence from Florida who had come to Knoxville with her own set of dreams. Her name was Colleen Slemmer, and she was about to become the unintended target of a darkness that had been growing in the heart of Christa Pike long before they ever met. The threads of their three lives were being drawn together into a knot that no human hand could untie. While Christa Pike was finding her place in Knoxville, another young woman had also come seeking a future. Her name was Colleen Slemmer, and she had traveled from Florida with hope in her heart. She did not know that her time on Earth was already being measured. In the vast, interconnected web of existence, some souls are born with a light that seems to invite the shadows, not out of any fault of their own, but because their sweetness serves as a mirror to the darkness of others. Colleen was such a soul. Born and raised beneath the expansive, bright skies of Florida, her early years were colored by the warmth of the sun and the salt of the sea. She was a child of the coast, a girl who loved the freedom of the outdoors and the simple, rhythmic glide of roller skates against the pavement. To those who knew her, she was the embodiment of a quiet, gentle kindness, a young woman who moved through the world with a mild-mannered grace and a persistent desire to be of help to those around her. Her journey was not one of privilege, but of determination. She had known the quiet ache of a family split by circumstance, yet she remained anchored by a mother, May Martinez, who loved her with a fierce and protective devotion. In the Martinez household, Colleen was a daughter and a sister, a pillar of a small, tight-knit world where loyalty was the primary currency. She was the kind of person who participated in the Special Olympics, not for the glory of the win, but for the joy of the participation and the chance to uplift her peers. There was a softness to her, a quietude that drew people in. She was not loud or demanding. She was a sweet, steady presence, a girl who would rather listen than speak, and who would rather give than take. As she reached the threshold of adulthood, Colleen began to look toward the horizon. She possessed a growing sense of independence, a quiet hunger to find her own way and to build a profession that would allow her to sustain herself. She chose the path of computing, a field of logic and order that appealed to her methodical mind. However, the state of Florida did not offer the specific government-run job training programs she required. The closest sanctuary for her dreams lay hundreds of miles to the north, in the rolling hills and mist-covered peaks of Tennessee. To move so far from home was a monumental decision, a leap of faith that required a strength many did not realize she possessed. Her mother, May, felt the weight of this distance before the first suitcase was ever packed. There is a maternal instinct that operates like a silent bell, ringing softly at the thought of a child wandering too far from the hearth. May and her husband spoke with Colleen, expressing their reluctance, their desire to keep her close where the Florida sun was familiar and the family was within reach. But Colleen was resolute. She saw Knoxville as her gateway, a place where she could prove to herself and the world that she was capable of standing on her own. "I actually got out," she told her mother, voice filled with a quiet pride. "I am not living at home." It was the declaration of a young woman claiming her life, unaware that the path she was choosing was winding toward a winter she would never survive. On October 31st, 1994, as the world prepared for the transition into the darker half of the year, Colleen Slemmer left Florida. It was the last time May Martinez would see her daughter in the light of the living. The journey to Tennessee was a transition from the flat, sandy expanses of the South to the vertical, ancient geography of the Appalachian foothills. When Colleen arrived at the Knoxville Job Corps Center, she found a world far removed from the roller skating rinks and Special Olympics of her youth. The 5 floors of the Dell Avenue Hotel were crowded with hundreds of young people, many of whom carried the jagged edges of troubled pasts. Colleen began her 6-month course in computing with the same quiet diligence that had always defined her. She attended her classes, spoke softly to her instructors, and tried to navigate the complex social landscape of the residence hall. Joe Mode, one of the teachers at the center, remembered her as a very sweet, quiet, and mild-mannered young lady. She would often come to his class just to talk about life, her voice a gentle murmur in the noisy environment of the center. She was trying her best, hoping to emerge from the program with the skills needed to begin a profession. But Knoxville, for all its colleges and cafes, held an undercurrent of volatility. It was not long before the sweetness that defined Colleen began to attract a different kind of attention. In an environment populated by those who had been hardened by the streets or the prison system, a quiet girl from Florida was an easy target for those who sought to exert power. Colleen began to experience a series of small, nagging cruelties that cast a shadow over her newfound independence. She spoke to her mother on the phone, her voice carrying the first notes of distress. She mentioned that a couple of kids were bothering her. They were going into her room, taking her jewelry, and stealing her clothes. It was a pattern of harassment that was both petty and profound, a violation of the small sanctuary she was trying to build for herself. She did not name her tormentors at first, referring to them only as 3 kids, 2 girls and a guy. To Colleen, they were likely just obstacles to be endured, part of the rough times that often come with moving to a new place. She did not realize that she was being watched by a predator who saw her quietude as a threat and her sweetness as a provocation. She was caught in the periphery of a love triangle she did not want and had not invited. The guy she mentioned was Tadderil Ship, and the 2 girls were Christa Pike and Shadala Peterson. In the warped architecture of Christa's mind, Colleen was not a fellow student or a quiet girl from Florida. She was a rival, a ghost of a past crush that needed to be eliminated with blood. Colleen's vulnerability was magnified by her distance from home. She was in a state where she knew few people, living in a facility that was increasingly failing to protect its brightest and gentlest students. As the jewelry disappeared from her room and the harassment intensified, Colleen continued to go to class, continued to hope, and continued to believe that if she just kept her head down and did her work, the trouble would pass. She was a good getter, as her mother called her, an independent spirit who believed in the power of her own effort. But effort is no shield against a meat cleaver, and independence is no armor against an obsession that has turned into an occult ritual. The contrast between the two young women was total. Christa Pike was the flame that sought to consume. Colleen Slemmer was the quiet hearth that sought to warm. Christa was the chameleon who could hide her nature. Colleen was the glass that showed everything. As the year moved toward its end, the harassment turned into a vendetta. The three kids were no longer just bothering her. They were orbiting her, closing the circle. Colleen's time in Knoxville, which had begun with such hope on that Halloween day, was being systematically dismantled by a darkness she could not have imagined in her brightest Florida dreams. Mae Martinez, far away in the south, could only listen to the fading cadence of her daughter's voice over the phone. She heard the struggles, the stories of the jewelry and the clothes, and she felt the distance between them growing into a canyon. She wanted her daughter home, back where the Special Olympics and roller skating provided a safer rhythm. But Colleen stayed. She stayed because she wanted to succeed, because she wanted to prove she could survive on her own. She stayed because she did not know that the impending doom her friend Kim felt was a bell tolling specifically for her. The quiet girl from Florida was becoming a figure of tragic isolation. In the crowded hallways of the Job Corps, she was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet she was being singled out for a fate that was as ancient as the mountains that loomed over the city. Her thread was being held by the Sisters of Fate, and the shears of Atropos were beginning to open. The computing course, the dreams of a profession, and the pride of independence were all being eclipsed by the shadow of a black leather jacket and the glint of a box cutter. As the middle of January approached, the harassment reached a silent, feverish peak. The jewelry was gone, the clothes were taken, and the three kids were ready to move from the hallways to the woods. Colleen Slemmer, who had come to Tennessee seeking a second chance, was instead standing at the edge of a 45-minute storm that would end her life and change the history of Knoxville forever. She was a spirit of light, about to be extinguished by a ball of fire that knew no mercy and felt no remorse. The stage was now set, the players were in place, and the air in Knoxville was brittle with the cold of a winter that was about to turn violent. In the heart of the Job Corps Center, a love triangle was tightening like a noose, drawing Christa, Tadderell, and Colleen into a final, irreversible alignment. It began, as so many tragedies do, with desire. Tadderell's ship was 17 when he arrived at the Job Corps Center, and two young women would soon orbit around him like planets around a dark star. One was Christa Pike. The other was Colleen Slemmer. Only one would survive. In the quiet, regulated world of the center, where lives were supposed to be rebuilt through the steady labor of learning, the ancient and volatile forces of human attraction were quietly weaving a web of obsession. Desire, when stripped of empathy and tempered by a fractured past, does not simply yearn, it possesses. It marks its territory with a jagged edge, and in the heart of East Tennessee, that territorial hunger was preparing to demand a terrible price. The introduction was a moment of quiet consequence. Kim, the girl who had seen Christa as a whimsical ball of fire, was the one who bridged the gap between two shadows. She had known Tadderall for a while. He was a young man of 17, possessing a presence that commanded the attention of those around him. When he first arrived and saw the girl with the reddish hair, he asked the question that set the gears of fate into their final rotation. Who is that? Kim, ever loyal and unaware of the gravity of the moment, replied with a simple introduction. She left them sitting together in the fading light, and from that moment on, Christa and Tadderall were inseparable. They became a unit, a closed circle that seemed to generate its own heat, drawing inward and away from the rest of the world. But before Christa had claimed the center of Tadderall's universe, there had been another. Before the reddish hair and the chameleon's charm had arrived from North Carolina, Tadderall's attention had lingered elsewhere. He had harbored a crush, a quiet interest in the girl from Florida, Colleen Slemmer. It was a fragment of a past attraction, a light that had flickered briefly before Christa's flame was ignited. In any other setting, such a shift in focus would be the mundane friction of youth, a brief romance that fades into the background of memory. But Christa Pike did not exist in a world of background memories. To her, the past was a living threat, and any woman who had once held a place in her partner's heart was a ghost that needed to be eliminated. The shift was absolute. Once Christa entered the frame, Tadderall's gaze went straight to her, forgetting everyone else. He became as consumed by her as she was by him. Yet, for Christa, the fact that his attention was now hers was not enough. She possessed a brand of jealousy that was not merely a feeling, but a physical weight, an extreme, unyielding possessiveness that Kim and others began to notice with a growing sense of unease. Christa did not merely want to be loved, she wanted to own the space where love resided. She saw Colleen not as a sweet, mild-mannered peer, but as a rival whose very existence was an affront to her dominion. It mattered little that Colleen was not pursuing Tadderall, or that she was simply trying to finish her computing course in peace. In the warped theater of Christa's mind, Colleen was a predator in the tall grass, a danger that was festering and growing with every passing hour. This obsession was not born of love, but of a deeper, more ancient darkness that had found a new language in which to express itself. Christa and Tadderall began to explore the edges of something forbidden, seeking an identity that set them apart from the good students and the mundane rules of the Bible Belt. They turned toward the occult, toward a brand of practices that provided a framework for their growing detachment from human empathy. It was an open secret among a small group at the center. They surrounded themselves with a different kind of literature and kept small altars in their rooms, seeking power in symbols of rebellion. Christa even marked her flesh with a small devil tattoo on her left chest, a permanent sign of her allegiance to the shadow. In Knoxville, a city where a church stands on nearly every corner and the rhythms of the Sabbath define the week, this embrace of the dark was a profound transgression. It provided Christa with a sense of grandiosity, a belief that she was moving in a realm where the standard laws of man did not apply. Tadderell, too, was drawn into this vortex, his own youth and troubled history finding a home in the rituals they practiced together. They were joined by a third member, Shadola Peterson, who became the silent observer and eventual participant in their shared descent. Together, they were a trinity of isolation, fueled by a love triangle that existed only in Christa's perception, and a belief system that sanctified her most violent impulses. The jealousy Christa felt was an elemental force, much like the deep, unmoving stone of the mountains that watched over the city. She could not let the perceived threat of Colleen go. She watched the girl from Florida move through the hallways, watched her talk to the instructors, and in every innocent gesture, Christa saw a calculation. She saw a girl who had once been the object of Tadderell's desire, and that was a transgression for which there could be no forgiveness. The rough times Colleen had mentioned to her mother, the stolen jewelry and the missing clothes, were the first tremors of the earthquake to come. They were Christa's way of testing the boundaries, of marking the victim before the ritual began. It is a chilling truth of human nature that the most dangerous kind of obsession is the one that believes itself to be justified. Christa truly believed she was protecting her union with Tadderell. She believed that Colleen was a threat to her happiness, a weight that needed to be removed so that she could finally find the peace she had been denied as a child. The occult elements she embraced provided the justification. The love triangle provided the target. The darkness that had been shaped by the empty cupboards and the silent nights of North Carolina had finally found a focus. It was no longer a general anger toward a world that had failed her. It was a specific, sharpened point aimed at the quiet girl who loved to roller skate. Kim, watching from the outside, felt the obsession festering. She saw the way Christa's eyes would follow Colleen, the way the whimsical fun ball of fire would grow cold and still when the rival's name was mentioned. There was a sense of impending misalignment, a feeling that the gears of the center were grinding against one another. The air in the converted hotel on Dell Avenue grew thick with a tension that few could name, but many could feel. In the heart of the Bible Belt, Under the shadow of the peaks, a girl of 18 was deciding that her desire was worth more than a life. She was preparing to move from the altars in her room to an altar in the woods, and the love she claimed to feel for Tadderel was the fuel for the coming fire. Tadderel remained by her side, an inseparable partner in this gathering gloom. Whether he truly saw Colleen as a threat or simply allowed himself to be swept up in Christa's storm is a question that lingers in the silence of the transcripts. But his presence was the validation Christa required. He was the dark star around which she orbited, and his attention was the prize she would defend with a meat cleaver and a box cutter. The three of them, Christa, Tadderel, and Shadola, began to withdraw further into their shared secrets, leaving the world of nursing courses and computing classes behind. They were no longer students, they were participants in a narrative of their own making. Story where the protagonist was one who takes lives and the victim was an innocent girl from Florida. As the days turned toward the middle of January, the love triangle reached a point of no return. The obsession had fully ripened, and the harvest was ready. Christa Pike was no longer satisfied with stolen jewelry or whispered threats. She wanted a permanent solution to the ghost of Tadderel's past. She wanted to prove her devotion through an act that would bind them together forever, a ritual of blood that would silence the perceived rival and elevate her to a status she had never known. The simple desire that had sparked in the light of an East Tennessee afternoon had grown into a conflagration that was ready to consume everything in its path. The quiet hallways of the Job Corps Center, where the light reflected off the polished floors, held their breath. The odd things that Joe Mode noted were about to escalate into a singular horror. Christa had made her choice, and the gears of fate were locked. The reddish hair, the whimsical voice, and the small devil tattoo were all converging toward a single Saturday afternoon when words would finally be spoken that could never be taken back. In the gathering dark of the center, the trinity of shadow was waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the hotel and into the park. The promise of marijuana was the lure, but the true destination was a remote boundary where the city ended and the silence began. The love triangle was about to break, and the pieces would fall in a pattern that would haunt Knoxville for generations. Saturday was approaching, a day of idle conversation and casual meetings where Christa would finally unveil her intent to the world. And though she would speak of ending a life with a smile and a wink, the weight of her words was already pressing down upon the life of Colleen Slemmer, a quiet girl whose only transgression was once being liked by a boy who now belonged to a monster. It was a Saturday afternoon in January, and 12 or 13 young people sat together in idle conversation, the way young people do when the weight of the week has lifted and the hours ahead seem endless. Names were mentioned, likes and dislikes were shared in the low, rhythmic hum of a social circle, finding its center. And then, through the casual drift of the afternoon, the name of Colleen Slemmer was spoken. What Christa Pike said next should have been a warning to all who heard it, a signal of the storm gathering in the quietest corners of her mind. But in the warmth of the room and the casual ease of the day, no one believed her. No one saw the glint of the cold flint behind the whimsy of her voice. They were gathered in a communal space, perhaps one of the rooms in the 5-story hotel turned sanctuary, where the light of a winter sun filtered through the glass, illuminating the faces of those who had come to Knoxville seeking second chances. The conversation moved like water, flowing from one student to another, touching on the petty grievances and the small triumphs of their shared lives. When Colleen's name emerged, Christa did not hesitate. She did not lower her voice or look away. Instead, she spoke with a terrifying clarity that froze the air for those who were truly listening. "Oh my God," she said, her voice light and almost melodic. "I am going to end her." Kim, the girl who had shared candy and laughter with Christa, was there. She looked at her best friend, the girl she believed to be a ball of fire and a protector, and felt a ripple of unease. She tried to steady the conversation, to pull the world back into a place of reason. "Leave that girl alone," Kim said, her own voice a soft plea for peace. "She didn't do anything to you." But Christa did not argue. She did not defend her hatred or explain her obsession. Instead, she simply smiled. She winked at Kim, a gesture so casual and playful that it seemed to strip the words of their jagged edges. She changed the subject then, moving on to the next topic with the grace of a dancer, leaving the thread hanging in the air like an invisible mist. We often dismiss the dark things spoken with a smile. We tell ourselves that it is merely the theatre of youth, the exaggerated drama of those who feel too much and know too little of the world's true capacity for ruin. Kim, in her 16-year-old innocence, did the same. She watched the wink and the smile, and she chose to believe in the friend she thought she knew. She did not realize that for Christa, the word was already a deed, and the deed was already a ritual. The casual Saturday afternoon was not an end, but a beginning, a public declaration of an intent that was already being measured by the unyielding shears of fate. The days that followed were a deceptive calm. The center moved through its daily rhythms. The students attended their nursing and computing classes, and the city of Knoxville continued its fast, busy growth. But on January 12th, 1995, the mask of the chameleon was adjusted for the final act. Christa came to Kim's room, a place that had always been a sanctuary for their shared secrets. She did not come with candy this time, nor did she come seeking comfort. She came to announce a departure. "Well," she said, standing in the doorway with that same whimsical energy, "we're getting ready to go to the park." Kim asked the question that anyone would ask, looking for the shape of the evening. "Who's going to the park?" Christa's answer was a roll call of the Shadow Trinity. Me, Shadola, and Tadaril, and Colleen. The inclusion of the fourth name felt like a weight dropping into deep water. Kim felt a chill that the radiator in the room could not reach. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. Christa leaned in, the light of the room catching the reddish hues of her hair. "We're going to go smoke in the park," she said. And then, once again, the gesture that would haunt Kim's dreams for decades to come. Wink and a smile. Kim stood on her balcony, a vantage point that felt like a watchtower at the edge of the world. She watched as the four of them walked toward the exit, their figures growing smaller as they approached the sign-out sheet. She saw them sign their names, 4 signatures on a piece of paper that would soon become a historical document. She watched as they stepped through the doors and out into the Knoxville evening, their silhouettes disappearing into the gathering dark. It was at that moment that Kim felt it, a heavy, cold sensation in the pit of her stomach. She would later describe it as an impending doom, a feeling that the air itself had become thin and brittle. She probably should have known. She probably should have said something to an instructor, or shouted from the balcony for Colleen to stay. But the world does not work in the clarity of hindsight. At that moment, she was a teenager, watching her friends go to smoke in the park. The wink and the smile were her only evidence of the darkness. And the darkness was a thing that 16-year-old girls are taught to believe is only found in movies or old books. She went back into her room, closing the door against the cold, while the 4 figures walked toward the streets that led to Tyson Park. The walk was not a long one, but it was a journey from the civilized world into the wild periphery. They moved toward Cumberland Avenue, 4 young people walking through the city lights, appearing to any passerby like a group of friends seeking a quiet spot under the stars. But 3 of them carried a secret, and Christa Pike carried something more, a meat cleaver and a box cutter, hidden within the folds of her clothing, like the weapons of an ancient and vengeful goddess. The premeditation was silent, rhythmic, and absolute. The Saturday promise was about to be fulfilled in the shadows beneath a bridge. As they walked, the sounds of the city began to fade. The cafes and the colleges were left behind, replaced by the rustle of dry winter grass and the hollow echo of footsteps on cold pavement. Colleen Slemmer, walking among them, likely felt the shift in the atmosphere. Perhaps she noticed that Christa and Tadaril were walking too closely together, or that Shadala was too quiet. Perhaps she remembered the jewelry that had gone missing from her room, or the clothes that had been taken. But the promise of the smoke, the desire to be included, and the inherent trust of a sweet, mild-mannered spirit kept her moving forward. The perfection of the location was not an accident. Christa had chosen a place where the city's gaze could not reach, a remote boundary between the park and the University of Tennessee. It was a place where the trees stood like silent sentinels, and the world was reduced to the 4 of them and the dark. The impending doom that Kim felt on her balcony was now a physical presence in the woods of Tyson Park. The city of Knoxville sat just a mile away, its lights a distant, unreachable shore. It would have been at this point, as they moved further into the remote location, that Colleen realized something was not right. The air was no longer merely cold, it was predatory. The conversation likely slowed, the casual laughter perishing in the throat of the evening. Christa was no longer the ball of fire. She was the night itself, vast and unyielding. The wink and the smile were gone, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. The argument, when it began, was not a debate, but an accusation. Christa began to speak of Tadderall, of aims and intentions, of a love triangle that Colleen had never asked to be a part of. The transition from words to violence was not a sudden burst, but a deliberate descent. In the rhythmic storytelling of the ancients, the hero must face a trial in the dark. But Colleen Slemmer was no hero of myth. She was a 19-year-old girl from Florida who wanted to learn about computers. She was facing a darkness that was not a test, but a ritual of destruction. The meat cleaver and the box cutter were drawn from their hiding places, their edges catching the faint, distant light of the city she had just left behind. The Saturday promise, spoken with a wink and a smile, was no longer a threat. It was an unfolding reality. Kim, back at the center, perhaps tried to sleep, or perhaps watched the clock, waiting for the sign-in sheet to be completed. She did not know that at 8:50 in the evening, the thread of her friendship had already been cut. She did not know that the 4 signatures she saw being written were the last time those 4 lives would ever exist in the same light. The walk to the park was over, and the 45-minute storm was about to break. The city of Knoxville remained oblivious, its churches and its colleges continuing their quiet winter vigil. But in the woods of Tyson Park, the boundary had been crossed. The 3 kids who had been bothering Colleen were now her judge, her jury, and her executioners. The promise made in the idle conversation of a Saturday afternoon was about to be written in blood upon the soil of Tennessee. While Kim sat in her room, the silence of the night was broken only by the hum of the city. She waited for the morning, for the smile and the wink to return, unaware that the girl who would knock on her door would be carrying a trophy that no friend should ever see. The darkness had found its vessel, and the ritual in the park was just beginning. At 8:50 in the evening on January 12th, 1995, 4 young people walked through the streets of Knoxville. 3 of them knew where they were truly going. 1 did not. The promise of marijuana had lured Colleen Slemmer toward a darkness she could not imagine, a destination hidden beneath the veil of a winter night, where the city's warmth would soon be replaced by the cold indifference of the woods. The journey began at the threshold of the Job Corps Center, that former hotel on Dell Avenue that had seen so many stories pass through its doors. The 4 figures stepped out into the crisp air, their breath likely blooming in small, pale clouds before them. They moved with a purpose that, to a casual observer, might have looked like the restless energy of youth seeking a moment of rebellion. They turned their faces toward Cumberland Avenue, a thoroughfare often bustling with the life of the nearby university. But on this night, it served as a long, illuminated corridor leading them away from safety. The rhythmic sound of their footsteps on the pavement provided a steady cadence, a heartbeat for a journey that was systematically leaving the civilized world behind. As they walked, the urban landscape began to shift. The brightly lit storefronts and the distant hum of traffic started to recede, replaced by the lengthening shadows of the trees and the cooling stone of the overpasses. They moved toward Tyson Park, a sprawling expanse of green that daylight was a place of recreation and laughter. But at nearly 9 o'clock in a January evening, the park becomes a different entity. It becomes a landscape of silhouettes and secrets, where the rustle of the wind in the dry branches sounds like a low, persistent whisper. They cut through the paths, moving with a familiarity that suggested the route had been considered long before the first step was taken. They passed under a bridge, a heavy structure of concrete and steel that acted as a physical barrier between the world of light and the world of shadow. Beneath the bridge, the air felt thicker, and the sounds of the city were muffled, as if the earth itself were pressing down to listen. It was here, in this transitional space, that the isolation began to feel absolute. To leave the city is to leave its protections, and with every yard they gained toward the remote interior of the park, the four were moving further into a realm where only their own intentions mattered. Christa Pike led the way, her reddish hair a dark flame in the moonlight. She moved with a deceptive lightness, the whimsical ball of fire still present in her stride. Yet her hands were never far from the hidden edges she had brought with her. She had come armed with a meat cleaver and a box cutter, tools of domesticity repurposed for a ritual of unyielding malice. The premeditation was not a loud or frantic thing. It was as quiet and measured as the narrator's voice. It was a choice made in the stillness of her room, a decision to bring the weight of metal into the soft silence of the woods. Beside her, Tadderel Ship and Shadola Peterson moved as silent echoes, their presence providing the walls of a trap that was slowly closing around the fourth member of their party. Colleen Slemmer walked among them, perhaps still holding on to the hope of the shared smoke, the promise of being included in the inner circle of her peers. She was a girl from Florida, accustomed to the openness of the sun, shore, and the enclosed vertical darkness of the Tennessee woods, must have felt strange to her. As they reached the boundary where the park met the grounds of the University of Tennessee, the landscape grew even more remote. The trees were thicker here, the undergrowth more tangled, and the distant lights of the campus appeared like unreachable stars. It would have been at this point, as the path narrowed and the shadows deepened, that Colleen likely felt the first true chill of realization. The transition from a walk to a confrontation is often a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the rhythm of breathing, a silence that lasts a heartbeat too long. One moment, they were 4 students in the night. The next, the alignment had shifted. Christa, Tadderel, and Shadola were no longer companions, but a unified front, their bodies forming a crescent that pushed Colleen towards the darker center of the grove. The air, which had been merely cold, now felt sharp, as if it were vibrating with the energy of a coming storm. It was the moment where the city was truly left behind, and the rules of the Dell Avenue Hotel were replaced by the older, harsher logic of the forest. Something is not right. The thought must have echoed in Colleen's mind with the steady persistence of a bell. She was in trouble. The accusations began then, drifting through the trees like smoke. Christa spoke of Tadderel, her voice no longer whimsical, but honed to a razor's edge. She spoke of Colleen's supposed aims, of the love triangle that had existed only in the architecture of an obsessed mind. In this remote location, where the only audience was the ancient wood and the cold stone, the jealousy that had been festering for months finally broke the surface. It was no longer a secret kept in a diary or whispered to a friend. It was a weapon being drawn in the dark. The landscape itself seemed to conspire in isolation. The slopes of the park provided natural bowls of shadow, places where a cry might be swallowed by the earth before it could ever reach a distant ear. The ground beneath their feet was a carpet of frozen leaves and winter detritus, muffling their movements as the circle tightened. Christa did not rush. She moved with the deliberate, rhythmic pace of a predator who knows the prey has nowhere to run. The meat cleaver and the box cutter were no longer hidden. They were part of the landscape now, their steel catching the dim, filtered light of the moon. Colleen, trapped between the people she thought were her peers and the unyielding boundary of the woods, found herself in a place where hope was a fragile, flickering thing. She was miles from the Florida coast, miles from the protective gaze of her mother, and hundreds of yards from the nearest living soul who might have intervened. The walk to Tyson Park had been a steady descent into a world where empathy was absent and only the yawning void remained. The promise of marijuana had been the lure, but the true destination was a 45-minute expanse of time that would stretch into an eternity. As they stood at the edge of the university boundary, the city of Knoxville continued its quiet Friday night rituals. Trolleys hummed along the streets, students laughed in the cafes, and the lights of the Smokies twinkled on the horizon. But in this specific, shadowed corner of the earth, the walk had ended. The movement had stopped, and the air had grown still. The 4 signatures on the sign-out sheet were now 4 lives poised at the edge of an abyss. Christa looked at Colleen, and the last vestiges of the fun-loving friend vanished, leaving only the cold, measured intent of a girl who believed she was about to do something great. The woods waited. The trees stood as silent witnesses to the shift from words to the first sharp movements of violence. The city lights were a memory, a distant glow that provided no warmth and no rescue. Colleen Slemmer was alone in the dark with the trinity of shadow, and the woods of Tyson Park were prepared to absorb the first droplets of the storm. The path had led exactly where Christa Pike had intended, to a place where time would slow down, and the only sound would be the struggle of a soul trying to cling to the light. The 45 minutes were about to begin. As the first accusations turned into the first physical strike, the silence of the park was broken, and the dark ritual that had been promised on a casual Saturday afternoon finally found its form. The world outside continued to turn, but within the grove, the stars themselves seemed to pause, waiting for the tragedy to unfold. What happened next in those woods took 45 minutes. 45 minutes in which a young woman fought for her life, begged for mercy, and found none. This is the hardest chapter to tell, but it must be told. For Colleen Slemmer deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as someone who fought until she could fight no more. A spirit that remained resilient even as the shadows of Tyson Park closed in around her. In the rhythmic cycle of the night, time is usually a gentle thing, a river that carries us toward sleep. But in the cold darkness of that January evening, time became a heavy, unyielding weight, slowing down until every second felt like a heartbeat echoing through the silence of the trees. The transition from the walk to the ritual was marked by a sudden, chilling shift in the atmosphere. The trinity of shadow, Christa, Tadderel, and Shadola, moved with a synchronized, quiet intent, surrounding Colleen in a space where the city lights could no longer reach. It began not with a roar, but with a series of sharp, stinging accusations that acted as the prelude to the storm. Christa's voice, once whimsical and high, had turned into something cold and metallic, reflecting the edge of the meat cleaver she now held in the moonlight. The struggle that followed was not a swift event. It was a persistent, agonizing sequence of movement and resistance. Colleen, driven by the most primal of human instincts, sought the light. Every time she tried to run, every time she moved toward the edge of the grove where the world made sense, she was intercepted. She was struck, she was cut, and she was forced back down into the frozen leaves. The duration of 45 minutes is a vast expanse of time when one is fighting for survival. It is longer than a standard lesson, longer than a drive across the city, longer than the quiet meditation of a prayer. During these minutes, the woods of Knoxville became a landscape of slow-motion endurance. To prevent her from fleeing further, her jacket and her top were removed, a cruel calculation designed to make the winter cold an ally of her captors and to strip her of the mobility needed to escape the thicket. Colleen did not surrender to the silence. She used her voice, begging for her life, pleading with the people she had walked with just moments before. She offered a compromise born of desperation. "If you'll let me go," she whispered into the dark, "I'll hitchhike out of here and go home tonight." She promised to vanish, to return to the Florida sun and leave the Tennessee winter behind forever. But the yawning void within Christa Pike did not recognize the language of mercy. Christa's response was a chilling confirmation of the ritual's finality. "You know it's too late for that," she replied, her words steady and devoid of the heat of passion. "You do know who's ending you." In this moment, the act transcended mere violence and became a declaration of power. It was the ultimate manifestation of the celebrity status Christa had sought in her own mind. As the minutes ticked away, the meat cleaver and the box cutter were used with a methodical, repetitive persistence. The medical examiner would later lose count of the wounds, noting over 300 marks upon her body, a testament to a violence that was not seeking an end but was reveling in the process. Each strike was a note in a dark symphony that Christa was conducting with a terrifying, overjoyed focus. While Colleen was still alive, the ritual took its most symbolic turn. Tadderel, acting under the direction of Christa's obsession, used a blade to carve a pentagram into Colleen's chest. The upside-down star, a symbol of the occult, was etched into the flesh, a permanent mark of the belief system that had allowed them to view a 19-year-old girl as a ritual offering rather than a human being. The Bible Belt, with its steeples and its hymns, sat just over the horizon. But here, in the boundary of the university woods, a different altar had been raised. The blood was the ink, and the soil was the page. The violence was relentless, and yet Colleen continued to breathe, her spirit clinging to the world with a strength that frustrated her attacker. Christa would later remark to her peers with a chilling lack of empathy that the girl wouldn't perish. It was a statement that revealed the depth of her detachment. To Christa, Colleen's struggle was not a human tragedy, but a technical difficulty in the completion of a task. When the blades proved too slow for the end she desired, Christa reached for the earth itself. She picked up a heavy piece of asphalt, a fragment of the paved world they had left behind, and began to strike Colleen's skull. She continued this until the sounds stopped, until the pleas were silenced, and until the quiet girl from Florida could no longer speak. In the final moments of the 45 minutes, the woods returned to their natural silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the three who remained standing. But the ritual was not yet complete. In a gesture that reaches back to the most primitive and dark instincts of history, Christa reached down into the aftermath of the struggle. She sought a souvenir, a physical piece of the victory she believed she had won, with a deliberation that defies the understanding of a compassionate mind. She plucked a fragment of Colleen's skull from the scene. This was her trophy, a shard of bone that she would carry back to the city, tucked into the pocket of her black leather jacket like a common stone found on a path. It was the ultimate theft, not of jewelry or clothes, but of the very structure of her victim. The trinity of shadow then began the walk back. They moved out of the woods, past the bridge, and back toward the lights of Cumberland Avenue. To any late-night traveler, they would have appeared as three teenagers returning from a night in the park, perhaps tired from their walk, perhaps quieted by the winter air. They returned to the Job Corps Center on Dell Avenue, and approached the sign-out sheet. With the same hands that had held the cleaver and the asphalt, they signed their names, marking their return at a specific hour and minute. The mundanity of the act, the pen on the paper, the ticking of the clock in the lobby stood in stark contrast to the 45-minute storm they had just left behind in the trees. What kind of mind can inhabit both worlds? What kind of heart can move from the prolonged harm of an innocent to the bureaucratic requirement of a sign-in sheet? The psychology of Christa Pike began to reveal itself in the silence of that return. It was a mind filled with grandiosity and ego, a psychopath's lack of remorse that allowed her to view the evening not with horror, but with a sense of accomplishment. She did not hide in the shadows. She walked back into the light of the center, the fragment of bone pressing against her side, a secret treasure that she was already eager to share. The 45 minutes were over, but the story was only beginning to find its voice. The woods of Tyson Park held the secret for a few more hours. The body of Colleen Slemmer, lying in a heap, partially displayed and partially covered by the winter night. The trees stood as silent sentinels over the place where the light had been extinguished. Back at the center, the bright students slept, the instructors made their rounds, and the city of Knoxville dreamed of the coming spring. But for Kim, waiting in her room 5 doors down from Christa, the night was about to be shattered by a knock on the door and a story that no best friend should ever have to hear. The contrast between the casual return and the horrific reality is the true chill of this narrative. It reminds us that the measured epic of human tragedy often takes place in the most ordinary of settings. A park, a bridge, a piece of asphalt. These are the elements of a common life. But in the hands of the ball of fire that was Christa Pike, they became the instruments of an ancient darkness. The 45 minutes had ended. The thread had been cut, and the souvenir of bone was now a bridge between the woods and the world of the living. As Christa climbed the stairs to the 5th floor, her reddish hair falling around her face, she was already preparing the words she would use to describe the deed. She was not a girl seeking a second chance. She was a conqueror returning from the field, ready to unveil her trophy and claim the celebrity she believed she deserved. The silence of the night was merely the canvas upon which she was about to paint her confession. She reached the door of her best friend, the girl who had brought her candy and shared the trolley rides. The knock was steady, the rhythm unchanged. When the door opened, the whimsical fun ball of fire would be there, ready to unfold a story of blood and stone that would change the lives of everyone it touched. Christa Pike returned to the Job Corps Center that night and went straight to her best friend's room, moving through the quiet corridors with a heavy, secret gravity. She knocked on the door, and when Kim opened it, Christa began to tell a story, not with the trembling voice of someone haunted by horror, but with something far more disturbing, a radiant, unyielding pride. In the stillness of the late hour, as the rest of the world settled into the soft embrace of sleep, the atmosphere within that small room shifted, becoming thick with a darkness that no lamp could illuminate. The girl who had once walked up a hill to bring her friend candy was now standing there, the winter air still clinging to her clothes, preparing to unveil a truth that would shatter the mirror of their friendship forever. Kim stood in the doorway, her mind still anchored in the innocence of the evening, expecting perhaps a whispered secret or a plan for the coming Sunday. But as Christa stepped inside, the whimsical fun ball of fire appeared changed, as if a veil had been stripped away to reveal the cold architecture of a predator. Christa began to speak, her words flowing with a terrifying rhythmic ease. She did not hesitate. She did not look for a way to soften the blow. She spoke of the woods, of the bridge, and of the girl from Florida, who had gone there seeking a shared smoke, but had found only the finality of the ritual. The girl couldn't perish, Christa said, her voice carrying a light, almost cheerful cadence that made the blood in Kim's veins feel like ice. The details emerged like fragments of a nightmare. Christa described the box cutter and the meat cleaver, the way the metal had met the night, and the way the girl had struggled against the inevitable. She spoke of cutting the throat 9 times, of the stabs to the back, and the relentless persistence of a life that refused to be extinguished. Kim stood there in total shock, her spirit retreating into a corner of her mind as the story unfolded. To hear such things from a stranger would be a burden, but to hear them from the person one called a best friend is a fracture that can never truly be healed. Kim's internal world was screaming, a silent chorus of, "This is not real." Yet the girl standing before her was undeniably present, her reddish hair reflecting the dim light, her eyes bright with the energy of her own grandiosity. As if the words were not enough to ground the horror in reality, Christa then reached into the pocket of her black leather jacket. With a movement that was slow and deliberate, she withdrew the trophy she had harvested from the shadows of Tyson Park. She showed Kim the fragment of Colleen's skull, a small, jagged shard of bone that carried the weight of a lost life. Christa spoke of stopping at a gas station on the walk back, of attempting to clean the blood from her hands and from the souvenir, as if she were polishing a stone found on a beach. In her mind, this was not evidence of a crime. It was a relic of a great deed, a physical manifestation of her own perceived power and celebrity status. She held the piece of bone as if it were a sacred thing, a bridge between the world of the living and the darkness she had embraced. The pride Christa displayed was a hallmark of the grandiosity often seen in The Psychology of the Psychopath. She was not seeking forgiveness. She was seeking an audience. She wanted Kim to witness her transition from a student in a nursing course to a figure of mythic, albeit terrible, proportions. But as the story reached its conclusion, the tone shifted from celebration to a cold, predatory warning. Christa looked at the 16-year-old girl who had been her inseparable companion and spoke a final, chilling sentence. "If you tell anybody, I will end you too." It was delivered with a smile and a wink, an echo of the same gestures that had once signaled friendship and shared jokes. In that moment, the ball of fire had become a conflagration that threatened to consume everything it touched. Christa told Kim she loved her, promised she would see her in the morning, and then stepped back out into the hallway, leaving Kim alone in a room that no longer felt like home. For Kim, the night was no longer a time for rest. It was a vast, waking landscape of terror. She tried to go to sleep, but the world had lost its stability. Every time she closed her eyes, a horror movie played against the back of her eyelids. A repetitive, relentless loop of Colleen's face, of the woods, and of the shard of bone. She was a naive, 16-year-old kid caught in a web of evil that she had no idea how to handle. She was trapped between the loyalty she had felt for her friend and the visceral, absolute fear of the monster that friend had become. The confession was a profound violation of the sacred space of friendship. It turned Kim into an unwilling accomplice to a secret that was too heavy for a child to carry. As the hours toward dawn ticked away, the silence of the Job Corps Center felt like a physical weight, a collective holding of breath before the discovery that was certain to come. Kim lay in the dark, the threat hanging over her like a blade, realizing that the girl 5 doors down was no longer the person she had ridden the trolley with. The wink and the smile were now the markers of a predator, and the candy Christa had once brought up the hill was a memory from a different life. The psychology of Christa's bragging reveals a level of ego that allowed her to celebrate the destruction of another human being. She likely enjoyed the terror she saw in Kim's eyes. She likely reveled in the power of being the one who held the secret. Evil, in this measured narrative, does not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it demands to be seen, to be honored, and to be feared. Christa had spent 18 years being moved from hand to hand, a child of neglect and shadow, and now she had finally found a way to ensure she was the center of the world, even if that world was one of blood and stone. Kim's impossible position was the ultimate cruelty of Christa's confession. She was the witness who could not speak, the friend who had seen the mask slip, and the victim of a threat that was all too real. She watched the sun begin to rise over the Smoky Mountains, knowing that somewhere in the woods of Tyson Park, the quiet girl from Florida was still lying in the heap where Christa had left her. The morning would bring the police, the questions, and the end of the Job Corps dream. But for Kim, the night would never truly end. The story told in that small room would remain a permanent part of her internal landscape, a record of the moment she learned that the people we love are sometimes the ones we should fear the most. Christa, meanwhile, likely slept with the ease of the unrepentant, the fragment of bone nearby, a physical reminder of the 45 minutes she believed had made her a queen. She had sign-in sheets to complete and a morning to face, and she would do so with the same glib, superficial charm she had always used to woo the world. She did not realize that the thread she had cut in the woods was the first of many that would now begin to unravel, leading the investigators back to the 5-story hotel and the reddish hair of the girl who couldn't stop talking about her trophy. The confession was the bridge between the hidden ritual and the public reckoning. It was the moment the secret began to leak out, carried in the trembling heart of a 16-year-old witness who had been given a gift she never wanted. The darkness had been spoken aloud, and once the words are in the air, they cannot be taken back. They linger in the corners of the room, waiting for the light of day to expose them for what they truly are. As the first light of January 13th touched the windows of the Dell Avenue Hotel, the city of Knoxville remained quiet, unaware of the horror that had been confessed in the dark. But the trail was already warm, and the morning would bring a discovery that would turn the celebrity status Christa craved into a sentence she would never escape. The body in the woods was waiting to be found, a silent testament to the 45 minutes and the shard of bone. And while Christa Pike prepared for her morning with a smile, the world was already preparing its judgment, guided by the sign-out sheet and the sleepless eyes of a best friend who knew too much. Morning came to Knoxville on January 13th, 1995, and with it, a discovery that would shake the city to its core. A body had been found near the quiet boundaries of Tyson Park, a form that was barely recognizable as human, resting in a place where the shadows of the previous night had finally retreated. In that moment, the cold reality of the world began to settle over the hills of Tennessee, and a mother's worst fear, kept at bay by hope and distance, was about to become an unyielding truth. The landscape of the park, usually a place of transition and green space for the nearby university, was now a scene of profound stillness. The winter light, pale and indifferent, filtered through the bare branches of the trees to illuminate a sight that no passerby was prepared to encounter. The victim was found in a heap, partially displayed and partially covered by the detritus of the woods. A quiet girl from Florida whose journey for a second chance had ended in a landscape of stone and shadow. The investigators who arrived on the scene found a body that bore the marks of a violence so persistent and so methodical that it seemed to belong to a different age. The throat had been cut, the forehead slashed, and upon the chest, a massive circle containing an upside-down star had been carved. A pentagram, the ancient calling card of a darkness that had found a new vessel in the heart of the Bible Belt. For the criminal investigator assigned to the case, Randy York, the scene was a testament to a cruelty that went beyond the ordinary. He arrived at the edge of the park around 7:30 in the morning, his breath visible in the biting air, to find a human being reduced to devastation. In his years of service, he had seen the many ways in which the human spirit can fail, but the marks on this young woman suggested a ritual of prolonged harm that lasted far longer than a moment of passion. The pentagram, in particular, stood out as a deliberate sign, a piece of dark theatre left behind by those who wanted their work to be seen and understood as a transgression against the sacred. While the investigators worked in the cold silence of the park, a world away in Florida, May Martinez was moving through a nightmare of her own making. She had spent the previous night and the early hours of the morning trying to reach her daughter. The phone in the residence hall had remained unanswered, or the voices on the other end offered only the hollow comfort of bureaucratic uncertainty. Colleen was not in her room. She was still out. She had not checked back in. Each sentence was a stone added to a growing wall of anxiety. May had felt the distance between Florida and Tennessee as a physical ache, a premonition that the independent spirit of her daughter had carried her into a storm she could not navigate alone. The call finally came after May returned from taking her youngest daughter to a doctor's appointment. It was a recorded message, clinical and brief, asking her to contact Detective York of the Homicide Department. In the quiet of her home, the air seemed to vanish. May's denial was absolute, a protective shield against a truth too heavy to bear. "That's not Colleen," she told herself, her voice a whisper against the rising tide of grief. She insisted it was a mistake, that her sweet, mild-mannered girl was merely lost or misplaced in the busy streets of Knoxville. But the request for dental records was the final, sharp movement of the shears. The identification would be positive, and the quiet girl who loved to roller skate would never return to the sun-drenched shores of her birth. Back at the Job Corps Center, the news began to spread like a cold mist through the 5 floors of the Dell Avenue Hotel. The students gathered in small groups, their voices hushed as the details of the discovery filtered back from the streets. Kim, the 16-year-old who had watched the 4 figures leave from her balcony, felt the impending doom she had sensed the night before settle into a permanent, crushing weight. She had seen them all leaving. She had seen the signatures on the paper. She had seen the wink and the smile of her best friend. The guilt began to gnaw at her, a repetitive internal accusation that if she had only spoken a word, if she had only shouted from the balcony, the heap in the woods might still be a girl in a computing class. The inevitability of the discovery was a direct result of the arrogance of the perpetrators. Christa Pike had not sought to hide her deed. She had sought to display it. By leaving the body in a way that was partially displayed, and by marking it with the pentagram, she had ensured that the trail would lead directly back to the door of the Job Corps. Randy York, moving with the methodical pace of a seasoned investigator, began to look at the sign-out sheet. It was a simple piece of evidence, a list of names and times that recorded the movement of souls in the dark. He saw 4 names that had left at 8:50 in the evening: Colleen Slemmer, Shadola Peterson, Christa Pike, and Tadderell Ship. He looked further down the list and saw only 3 signatures of return. The arithmetic of the crime was as simple as it was chilling. 4 had gone to the park, and only 3 had come back to sign the book. The signatures of Christa, Tadderell, and Shadola were there, written in the same hands that had held the cleaver and the asphalt, a record of their presence in the world of the living. while Colleen remained in the woods. Randy York did not need to search far for his suspects. They were within the walls of the center, sleeping in their rooms 5 doors apart, perhaps still carrying the scent of the winter woods upon their clothes. The investigation moved from the park to the hotel, and the quiet halls of the Dell Avenue facility were soon filled with the heavy tread of officers. The body in the woods served as a silent witness, its wounds telling the story of the 45 minutes and the souvenir of bone. The medical examiner's report would eventually detail the sheer number of strikes, but the initial sight was enough to establish the nature of the evil at work. It was a crime of persistence, of a girl who wouldn't perish, and an offender who wouldn't stop. As the investigators gathered the evidence, the piece of asphalt, the traces of blood in the frozen grass, the profile of the perpetrator began to take shape. It was not the work of a professional or a calculated assassin, but the work of someone fueled by an ego so vast it demanded a trophy. For Knoxville, the discovery was a rupture in the social fabric. In the Bible Belt, where the presence of a church on every corner suggested a world governed by a shared morality, the sight of a pentagram carved into a 19-year-old girl was an intrusion from a darker, more ancient realm. It spoke of a secret world operating beneath the surface of the Job Corps Center, a world of altars and literature that the bright students and the hard-working instructors had not seen. The body in the woods was the evidence that the odd things Joe Mode had noticed were not merely the growing pains of a troubled environment, but the early tremors of a profound psychological collapse. May Martinez continued to struggle in the quiet hours of her Florida home, her mind replaying the last time she had seen Colleen on October 31st. She remembered the independence in her daughter's voice, the pride of getting out, and the hope of a computing career. Each memory was now a fragment of a life that had been systematically dismantled in 45 minutes of darkness. The trail that led back to Christa Pike was one paved with stolen jewelry, missing clothes, and the casual threats of a Saturday afternoon. It was a trail that had been visible to anyone who knew where to look. But it was only after the discovery in the woods that the full picture became clear. Detective York and his team began to post officers at the rooms of the suspects, ensuring that the trinity of shadow could not slip away into the city. The sign-out sheet, the pentagram, and the missing girl had converged into a singular, unyielding focus. The investigation was no longer about searching for a victim. It was about confronting the monsters who had returned to sign their names. Christa Pike, the 18-year-old with the reddish hair and the whimsical voice, was now at the center of a different kind of spotlight. The celebrity status she had craved was arriving, but it would not be found in the cafes of the Strip or the laughter of the trolley. It would be found in the clinical, cold environment of an interrogation room and the silent judgment of a courtroom. The morning of January 13th ended with the city of Knoxville in a state of shock, and a mother in Florida beginning a journey of grief that would last a lifetime. body had been moved, the evidence gathered, and the woods of Tyson Park were left with only the disturbed earth to mark where the struggle had occurred. But the story was far from over. The confession was yet to come, and the details of the ritual, the overjoyed nature of the perpetrator, and the shard of bone would soon be unveiled to a world that could scarcely believe such darkness could exist in a girl of 18. As the suspect rooms were guarded and the city held its breath, the sign-out sheet sat in the lobby of the Job Corps, its 4 names a permanent record of the night the light was extinguished. The investigation was moving toward its climax, and the measured epic of Colleen Slemmer was transitioning from a discovery in the woods to a reckoning that would echo through the years. The trail was hot. The suspects were caught in the web of their own arrogance, and the detective was prepared to ask the questions that would reveal the heart of the yawning void. The next chapter of the story was about to begin, and it would start with a confession that would leave even the most seasoned investigators in a state of disbelief. Detective Randy York had seen many terrible things in his years as an investigator, navigating the fractured landscapes of human impulse and the aftermath of violence. But when he looked at the sign-out sheet from the Job Corps Center and saw 4 names, 3 of which had returned while 1 remained missing, he knew he was dealing with something different. It was a coldness that did not belong to the winter air, but to the calculations of a mind that had entirely detached itself from the weight of a human life. The investigation was no longer a search for a wandering soul. It was a methodical descent into the secret world of the 3 who had come back, a world hidden behind the thin walls of the former hotel on Dell Avenue. The process of the law began with the placement of officers. Randy York ensured that a guard stood at the threshold of each suspect's room, sealing off the exits and preserving the silence of the 5th floor. When the search of the living quarters commenced, the investigators did not find the typical belongings of 18-year-old students. In the room belonging to Tadderill's ship, they discovered a dark sanctuary that stood in stark defiance of the surrounding Bible Belt. There was an occult altar carefully arranged, and a Bible that had been repurposed for a different kind of devotion. There was literature that spoke of ancient shadows and rituals of blood, themes that mirrored the jagged marks found on the body in Tyson Park. In the room of Christa Pike, the findings were equally chilling. More literature, more evidence of an obsession with the occult, and a collection of items that suggested their interest in the dark was not a passing phase, but a deeply rooted identity. The more the investigators learned about the trio, the more they realized the extent of their immersion. These were not merely troubled youths. They were individuals who had sought a framework for their most violent inclinations. Christa Pike carried the mark of this allegiance on her own skin, a small devil tattoo etched onto her left chest, a permanent emblem of the yawning void she inhabited. To the people of Knoxville, where the rhythms of life were governed by tradition and faith, this revelation was an oddity that bordered on the incomprehensible. But for Randy York, it provided the motive and the method. The pentagram in the woods was not a random act of vandalism. It was a signature, a piece of a larger, darker architecture that Christa had been building for months. The suspects were taken into custody, and it was here, in the clinical environment of the interrogation room, that Christa Pike truly began to reveal the nature of her mind. Most who find themselves in the grip of the law after such a deed are either silent, defensive, or consumed by a frantic regret. Christa was none of these things. She was, as the detective would later describe her, overjoyed. There was a happiness in her manner that was unsettling, a behavior so light and silly that it seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. She did not try to hold anything back. She did not seek to minimize her role or offer the standard excuses of a fractured childhood. Instead, she spoke with a terrifying enthusiasm, as if she were narrating the highlights of a great victory. The confession was a performance. Christa did not merely tell the story, she acted it out. She got down on the floor of the interrogation room to demonstrate the positioning of the body, showing the investigator how Colleen Slemmer had begged for her life. She mimicked the pleas of the victim, her whimsical voice taking on a cruel, theatrical quality as she recounted the 45-minute struggle. There was no remorse in her eyes, no empathy for the girl from Florida who had once been her peer. The investigators watched in a state of growing disbelief as the 18-year-old girl celebrated the prolonged harm she had inflicted. The fact that she had bragged to her peers and was now bragging to the law pointed to a level of grandiosity and ego that is the hallmark of the psychopath. She likely enjoyed the retelling as much as she had enjoyed the act itself, finding in the detective's gaze the celebrity status she so desperately craved. The details of the ritual were confirmed through her own words. She spoke of the carving of the pentagram, the 9 cuts to the throat, and the final heavy blows with the asphalt. She confirmed the theft of the skull fragment, the souvenir of bone that she had carried back in her black leather jacket. The investigation had moved quickly from the discovery of a body to the full disclosure of a monstrous intent. Randy York realized that he was not dealing with a crime of passion or a sudden burst of anger. This was a premeditated ritual of destruction, a slow-motion execution carried out by someone who felt a profound joy in the sounds of a perishing victim. The charges were filed on January 15, 1995, naming Christa Pike, Tadderall Shipp, and Shadola Peterson as the architects of Colleen Slemmer's end. While the legal machinery began to grind toward the trial, the psychological profile of Christa continued to sharpen. She was a master of manipulation, a person who could project a superficial charm while harboring a heart of unyielding flint. The investigators saw through the wink and the smile, recognizing it as the mask of the chameleon. They understood that the love triangle and the jealousy were merely the catalysts that allowed her to unleash a violence that was already present, a storm that had been brewing since her childhood in North Carolina. The occult practices provided the justification, giving her a sense of divine right to act upon her darkest impulses. In her mind, she was not a perpetrator. She was a priestess of a dark order, and Colleen was the necessary ritual offering. The impact of the investigation on the Job Corps Center was profound. The noble intent of the program to provide a second chance for the troubled had been violated by a darkness it was not equipped to contain. Joe Mode and the other instructors were left to grapple with the reality that they had been teaching a girl who was capable of such heinous acts. The bright students, who had already been harassed and intimidated, felt the weight of the tragedy as a confirmation of their fears. The center, once a hotel of hope, was now a crime scene, its 5 floors haunted by the knowledge of what had happened in the woods of Tyson Park. The investigation had pulled back the veil, revealing that even in the heart of the Bible Belt, the odd things can grow into a singular, epoch-defining horror. May Martinez, far away in Florida, received the news of the charges with a grief that had no bottom. The dental records had confirmed the positive identification, and the story of the overjoyed confession and the pentagram added a layer of cruelty to her loss that no mother should ever have to endure. She learned of how her daughter had begged for mercy, and how that mercy had been denied with a smile. The investigation had provided the who and the how, but the why remained a yawning void that no amount of evidence could ever truly fill. Colleen was gone, and the 3 who had signed the book were now behind bars, waiting for the judgment of a city that was struggling to understand the monster in its midst. Randy York's work was nearly done, but the weight of the case would remain with him long after the files were closed. He had seen the happy demeanor of the offender, a sight that stood in stark contrast to the ruin he had found in the woods. The investigation had established a clear, unyielding trail of evidence. The sign-out sheet, the altar, the tattoo, and the bone. It was a perfect storm of proof that left no room for doubt. Christa Pike was the ringleader, the force that had driven the trinity of shadow into the dark, and her own words had become the strongest weapon against her. As the suspect rooms were cleared and the evidence was catalogued for the courtroom, the city of Knoxville began to prepare for a trial that would be unlike any in its history. The 18-year-old girl with the reddish hair was no longer a student or a best friend. She was a defendant facing the ultimate penalty. The investigation had laid the foundation for justice, but the theater of the courtroom would soon provide a new stage for Christa's grandiosity. The city-county building was waiting, and the seats would be filled with those who wanted to see if the girl who laughed in the face of mortality would still be smiling when the verdict was read. The investigation had revealed a darkness that was both ancient and modern, a ritual of blood that had taken place just a mile from the colleges and cafes of a growing city. It had shown that the chameleon can hide in plain sight, and that a whimsical ball of fire can be the light of a funeral pyre. The sign-out sheet remained a permanent record of the night the four went out, but the confession was the map that showed exactly where they had gone. While the suspects waited in their cells, the city looked toward the trial with a mixture of dread and a hunger for resolution. The measured epic of Christa Pike was moving from the secret rooms of the Job Corps to the public eye of the law. The next chapter would be written in the formal, rhythmic language of the court, where the wink and the smile would meet the unyielding silence of the jury. The trail had led from the woods to the hotel, and from the hotel to the interrogation room. Now, it led to the courtroom, where the reddish hair and the small devil tattoo would be presented as the evidence of a soul that had crossed a boundary from which there is no return. The overjoyed nature of the confession was about to meet the somber weight of the law, and the story of Colleen Slemmer was preparing for its final public reckoning. The City-County building in Knoxville stands at the center of government, a place where justice is meant to be served with the somber weight of law and tradition. In 1996, Christa Pike walked into its courtroom, moving through the heavy doors into a space of hushed whispers and polished wood. She was 18 years old, accused of taking a life that had stained the local soil. Yet as she took her seat, she was smiling. It was a sight that unsettled the gallery and chilled the hearts of those who had come to witness the reckoning of a life taken too soon. To look upon her was to see a young woman who appeared almost festive, as if the gravity of the trial were merely a backdrop for a new kind of social stage. The courtroom setting was formal and hushed, a cathedral of civic order designed to strip away the whimsy of the world and replace it with the cold clarity of evidence. But Christa seemed to inhabit a different reality. Her behavior was noted by all who sat in the high-backed benches. She would look around the room with a restless curiosity, seeking out faces in the audience. And on one occasion, she was seen waving at someone she knew with the casual cheer of a student in a hallway. There were moments of laughter and giggling shared with her attorney, and she spent much of the proceedings writing notes to her mother, her pen moving with a frantic, light energy. It was a display of a twisted celebrity status, a manifestation of an ego that found nourishment in the focused gaze of the public, even when that gaze was one of condemnation. May Martinez sat in the same room, a mother whose world had been reduced to a singular, agonizing focus. She had traveled from Florida to sit in the presence of the person who had dismantled her daughter's future in 45 minutes of darkness. May found it impossible to look directly at Christa. The pain was a physical barrier that prevented her eyes from meeting the gaze of the girl with the reddish hair. Christa, in turn, never faced May. She never offered a glance of recognition or a shadow of remorse toward the woman whose heart she had broken. They occupied the same small geography of the courtroom, yet they were separated by a canyon of empathy that no legal argument could ever hope to bridge. trial moved with the steady, rhythmic pace of the law, each witness adding a layer to the narrative of the night in Tyson Park. But no witness carried more weight than Kim, the girl who had once been Christa's inseparable companion. Kim stood before the court, her youth and her terror visible to all, and fulfilled a final, painful service to the memory of Colleen Slemmer. She told the jury of the night Christa returned to the 5th floor of the Job Corps Center. She described how Christa had danced around the small room, celebrating the deed with a terrifying, overjoyed happiness. Kim spoke of the confession, the boast of the 9 cuts to the throat, and the pride with which Christa had displayed the shard of bone. To hear these words spoken aloud in the silence of the court was to understand the true nature of the ball of fire that Kim had once called a friend. It was the testimony of a broken trust, a record of the moment a best friend became a monster. A moment of profound controversy occurred when the physical evidence of the struggle was presented to the jury. The skull of Colleen Slemmer was brought into the room, a silent and harrowing witness to the violence of the asphalt and the meat cleaver. As the remains were passed among the jurors, the fragment of bone that Christa had taken as a souvenir was absent, leaving a jagged gap in the structure of the girl from Florida. The sound of the remains moving through the jury box, the quiet clicks of bone against wood, was a rhythm of mortality that no one in the room would ever forget. It was reported that as the jury looked upon the damage she had wrought, Christa sat at her table and cried. Whether those tears were for Colleen or for the realization that her own thread was now being measured for the cut is a question that lingers in the silence of the transcripts. For May Martinez, the ordeal of the trial was a secondary trauma. The rules of the court were strict. She was required to maintain a stoic silence, forbidden from any emotional outburst or vocal expression of her grief. To sit inches away from the laughter and the waving, to watch the skull of her child being handled like a piece of evidence was a burden that took a heavy toll on her spirit. She suffered from relentless nightmares, the images of the woods and the body parts playing in a loop that medication could barely soften. She had seen the ruin of her daughter's body during the identification process, and now she was forced to see it again through the clinical lens of the law. The deliberation of the jury was a brief and final movement in this tragic symphony. On March 29th, 1996, they returned with a verdict of guilty for taking the life of Colleen Slemmer. The speed of their decision was a testament to the clarity of the evidence and the profound impact of Christa's own words. The next day, the court gathered for the sentencing. The jury had taken only 9 minutes of actual deliberation time, excluding a break for lunch, to decide that Christa Pike should face the ultimate penalty. It was an almost unheard of speed, a collective declaration that they saw no good in the young woman before them. The judge's voice was calm and measured as he read the order. At 18 years of age, Christa Pike was sentenced to perish by electrocution. May God have mercy on your soul." The words echoed through the room, a final, somber beat in the legal narrative. Having just received a capital sentence, most would have been catatonic, swallowed by the realization of their own impending end. But Christa's reaction remained consistent with the grandiosity she had displayed since the beginning. Within a matter of mere hours, she took a piece of paper and a pen and began to write a letter to Tadderel Ship, who was also facing his own reckoning in the shadow of the crime. The letter was unrepentant, almost chuckling in its tone. "Hey love," she wrote, the words flowing with the same whimsical energy she had used to describe the 9 cuts to the throat. "Can you believe they did this to me?" She spoke of the sentence as if it were a minor inconvenience, a misunderstanding by a world that failed to appreciate her. "I tried to be nice to her," she claimed, referring to the girl she had harmed for 45 minutes. "Look what they did to me. That sucks." It was a final confirmation that the mask of the chameleon was not a mask at all, but the true face of a soul that could not recognize the suffering of others. As the court adjourned and the reddish hair was led away in chains, the city of Knoxville began to breathe again. The trial had been a long, dark journey through the yawning void of a psychopath's mind, and the verdict provided a sense of resolution, however cold. But for May Martinez, the end of the trial was not the end of the story. The capital sentence was a promise of justice, but it was also the beginning of a long, uncertain wait. Colleen was gone, her sweet, mild-mannered presence replaced by the cold memory of a skull and a shard of bone. And Christa was moving toward a cell where the clock would tick for 23 hours a day in the silence of the row. The 16-year-old Kim, who had provided the service of her testimony, was left to carry the weight of her memories into an adulthood that would always be shadowed by the Saturday promise and the wink. She had seen the celebrity status Christa craved, and she had seen the final electric price that would be demanded for it. The courtroom on Dell Avenue returned to its quiet, civic duties, but the echoes of Christa's laughter and the sight of the skull remained, a permanent part of the history of Knox County. The transition from the trial to the prison was a move from the public eye to the deep isolation of the state's highest security. Christa Pike was no longer a student or a girl in a black leather jacket. She was a number, a condemned soul waiting for the shock of sufficient current. But even as the iron gates closed, the storm within her was far from dissipated. The prison would soon learn that the youngest woman on the row carried a darkness that could not be contained by walls or chains. The letter to Tadderel, written with such casual indifference, was the first sign that the capital sentence would not be the final word in the story of Christa Pike. She had survived the trial with her ego intact, and she was entering the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center not as a penitent, but as a queen of her own dark kingdom. The wait for the final day had begun, and the shadows of Tyson Park were following her into the cell. Most people, upon receiving a capital sentence, would be broken. They would weep, pray, or fall into a deep and heavy silence as the realization of their own mortality settled over them like a shroud. Christa Pike, within hours of her sentencing, took pen and paper and wrote a letter to Tadderill's ship that carried the same whimsical, unrepentant energy she had displayed in the halls of the Job Corps. "Hey, love," the letter began. "Can you believe they did this to me?" It was a document devoid of remorse, a testament to a mind that viewed the destruction of a human life and the subsequent judgment of the state as a mere series of unfortunate events. She spoke of her victim with a chilling indifference, claiming she had tried to be nice, and concluded that the sentence simply sucked, as if she were a traveler complaining of a delayed train rather than a woman condemned to the electric chair. The journey from the courtroom to the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville was a transition from the public theater of the law to the quiet, rhythmic isolation of the Row. Here, Christa became a singular figure, a unique resident of the state's high-security landscape. She was, and remains, the only woman in Tennessee facing the finality of execution. Her life was reduced to a singular cell where she was confined for 23 hours out of every 24, with only 1 hour of exercise to break the monotony of the stone and the steel. In such an environment, the spirit often withers or turns inward toward reflection. But for Christa, the confinement was not a cage for her impulses. It was merely a new stage upon which her violent tendencies and her mastery of manipulation could continue to play out. The nothing to lose mentality of a condemned prisoner is a dangerous force, and in the case of Christa Pike, it manifested in a persistent refusal to abide by the rules of the living. Her history of violence did not lay dormant behind the iron gates. In the mid-90s, she found herself in the company of other women whose lives were defined by blood and anger. Among them was Patricia Jones, a woman who was not to be trifled with, possessing a past as aggressive and dark as Christa's own. Jones had been convicted of the repeated stabbing of an elderly woman to her end, and she carried herself with the hard gravity of a predator. Within the prison walls, a new trinity of shadow formed, a relationship between Christa and an inmate named Natasha Cornett, with Patricia Jones standing as a negative force against their bond. On August 24th, 2001, the volatile elements of this environment reached a breaking point. A fire had broken out within the prison, and in the ensuing chaos, officials made the fateful decision to place these 3 violent women in the same confined space. It was a move that underestimated the predatory nature of the girl with the reddish hair. Seeing an opportunity to strike at her rival, Christa turned on Patricia Jones. While Natasha Cornett distracted the target, Christa moved with the quiet, measured intent of a hunter. She used a shoelace, a mundane item of clothing repurposed as an instrument of harm, and wrapped it around Patricia's neck from behind. The struggle was a visceral echo of the woods in Tyson Park. Christa was determined to choke the life out of Jones, pulling the cord tight until her victim's eyes began to bulge and her breath failed. It was reported that Christa later spoke of the attack with the same overjoyed enthusiasm she had shown during her original confession, remarking to the guards that they should have heard the sound of the gurgling. To Christa, the near ending of a cellmate's life was not a horror, but a source of amusement, a way to pass the time in the silence of the row units. Patricia Jones was only saved when prison officers managed to intervene, reviving her breathing just as she teetered on the edge of the void. For this act, on August 12, 2004, Christa was convicted of attempted first-degree homicide, and 25 additional years were added to a sentence that was already meant to end in execution. But the violence was only one facet of her life behind bars. Christa Pike remained a master of the wink and the smile, a charming manipulator who used her superficial grace to woo those who were tasked with her containment. She was a prolific writer of letters, reaching out to men beyond the prison walls, weaving stories of her innocence and her hope for a future she knew she did not deserve. Her ability to influence others was so profound that she managed to entangle 2 correctional officers in her web. One was reported to have engaged in a physical relationship with her, a violation of the sacred boundaries of the institution. The other, perhaps even more dangerously, was convinced to help her escape. This guard, moved by Christa's manipulation and the ball of fire persona she projected, took the keys to the cells and had a duplicate made. He brought the extra key back, hidden and ready, intending to help the notorious offender slip out into the night. In his mind, they were to escape together and live a life on the run, a romantic fantasy constructed entirely of Christa's design. It was a testament to the high level of psychopathy she possessed, the ability to make a law-abiding man believe that a woman who had carved a pentagram into a girl's chest was a partner worthy of his freedom. The conspiracy was caught before it could be executed, and the guard was fired. But the incident served as a stark reminder that even in chains, Christa Pike was a threat to the order of the world. To Christa, these events were not failures, but parts of the celebrity status she believed she had earned. Every letter, every attack, and every fired guard added to the myth she was building for herself. She moved through her days with a sense of entitlement, believing that the attention she received was her birthright. Her thought process remained entirely self-serving, focused on how she could get people to do what she wanted and how she could escape the consequences of her actions. She showed no accountability, no growth, and no realization of the pain she had caused to Mae Martinez or the memory of Colleen Slemmer. She was the same person who had walked into Tyson Park, only now she was seasoned by years of confinement and the knowledge that the state's ultimate penalty was always lingering in the background. Her attorneys made multiple attempts to have her removed from the row, filing appeals in both federal and state courts. They spoke of her childhood, of the rolling hills of North Carolina, and the neglect she had suffered. They sought to find a legal path away from the electric chair, arguing that the sentence was too harsh for a girl of 18. But each time, the courts looked at the evidence, the premeditation, the 45 minutes of prolonged harm, the trophy of bone, and the subsequent violence in prison, and they let the sentence stand. The law remained as unyielding as the flint she had used to fashion her malice. The psychology of her survival on the row is a study in the resilience of the unrepentant. She did not seek redemption. She sought to thrive within the shadow. She embraced the identity of the unique prisoner, the only woman facing the shock of the current. And she used that status to maintain a sense of power over those around her. While Colleen Slemmer had been denied the chance to grow old, to find a profession, or to return to the Florida sun, Christa Pike spent her years orchestrating prison romances and survival schemes. The contrast between the two lives. One extinguished, and the one festering in a cell, remained the central tragedy of the narrative. As the decades passed, the reddish hair began to age, and the whimsical voice perhaps grew a fraction deeper, but the yawning void remained unchanged. Christa continued to wait, confined for those 23 hours a day, watching the sun move across the floor of her cell. She claimed in interviews that she didn't think about the electric chair because she didn't think she would ever truly see it. She maintained a hope that was not based on remorse, but on her belief in her own ability to manipulate the final outcome. She was troubled, as some described her, but she was someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and she was prepared to wait as long as the state allowed. The prison at the edge of memory continued to hold her, its walls a barrier between her darkness and the world of the living. But the stories of the shoelace, the duplicate key, and the letters to Tadderall proved that the walls were not absolute. Christa Pike remained a presence, a lingering shadow in the history of Tennessee, a woman whose name was synonymous with a violence that could not be tamed. The wait for justice was a long, slow grind, and the years were beginning to pile up like the frozen leaves in Tyson Park. Mae Martinez, still waiting in the South, followed every appeal and every incident with a weary but resolute heart. She knew that as long as Christa breathed, the story was not over. The capital sentence was a promise that had been made in 1996, and the passage of time had not diminished its necessity in the mind of a mother. The shock of fate was still coming, and the final chapter was beginning to draw its first breath. As the sun set over the rehabilitation center in Nashville, casting long, barred shadows across the exercise yard, Christa Pike returned to her cell. The door closed with a heavy, metallic finality, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the fragment of the past she still carried in her mind. The cycle of vengeance and law was moving toward its conclusion, and the world was preparing for the moment when the current would finally meet the girl who wouldn't perish. And so the years pass, moving with the slow, inevitable rhythm of the turning tide. Christa Pike remains on the row, breathing the recycled air of the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center, while the daughter of Florida, Colleen Slemmer, exists only as a memory and a portrait in a grieving home. A date for the final execution was once supposed to be set in the year 2020, but the world changed in ways no oracle could have foreseen, and the global pause of a pandemic reached even into the silent halls of the condemned, delaying the hand of the state once more. May Martinez still waits, her patience as vast and unyielding as the mountains that watched over Tyson Park on that cold January night, and she will wait for as long as it takes for the circle to finally close. In the quiet of her long confinement, Christa has sat for interviews, her voice still carrying that high whimsical quality that once charmed her peers and misled her teachers. When asked about the electric chair, that heavy wooden throne of justice that has waited for her since 1996, she speaks with a detached, almost ethereal confidence. "I don't really think about that," she says, her eyes untroubled by the shadow of the current. "I don't think I'm ever going to see it." She speaks of her situation as if she were an innocent traveler detained by a bureaucratic error, claiming with a straight face that she does not deserve to be where she is. It is the final, ultimate manifestation of the chameleon nature, a total rejection of the 45 minutes in the woods and the shard of bone she once carried as a trophy. There has been no remorse observed in Christa Pike at any point during these long decades of waiting. Not in the courtroom where she giggled and waved, not in the prison yard where she sought to choke a rival with a shoelace, and not in the private moments of reflection that the row usually demands. She does not say she is sorry. She does not offer a prayer for the girl whose life she dismantled. Instead, she appears happy in her television appearances, a woman who has found a strange, twisted sanctuary in her own notoriety. Those who have studied her from the perspective of the law and the mind see a perfect storm of nature and nurture, a predisposition for violence met with a childhood of neglect, resulting in a soul that truly believes its greatest deed was the ritualistic destruction of another. May Martinez, however, has not allowed the silence of the years to dull the edge of her resolve. She has become the guardian of her daughter's memory, a steady and unwavering voice in a world that often forgets the victims once the trial has ended. "I will never forgive Christa Pike. Never," May declares, her words a solemn vow that carries the weight of a sacred oath. She prepares for the day of execution, not with a hunger for vengeance, but with a requirement for justice. She intends to be there, to stand in the presence of the final shock, holding Colleen's picture up so that the last thing the offender sees is the face of the girl she tried to erase. For May, the journey will not be over until the state fulfills the promise it made 3 decades ago. The legacy of Colleen Slemmer is not defined by the violence of her end, but by the love that refuses to let her vanish. May speaks of herself as Colleen's voice, and she has ensured that this voice will never be silenced. Even when May is gone, the task will pass to Colleen's younger sister, a generational relay of remembrance that ensures the tragedy is never forgotten. The cost of evil is measured in these long, exhausting years of waiting, in the nightmares that require medication to soften, and in the empty chair at every family gathering. It is a nightmare that May lives every day, a recurring storm that only the finality of the law can truly dissipate. The philosophical questions linger in the air like the mist over the smoky mountains. What is it that creates such a yawning void in a human spirit? Can a child born into hunger and shadow ever find their way to the light? Or are some threads spun by the fates with a darkness that no amount of care can unravel? We look at Christa Pike and we see the fractures of our own world, the failure of protection, the persistence of trauma, and the terrifying capacity for a human heart to find joy in the suffering of others. We ask if understanding the causes can ever excuse the crime, and the answer remains as cold and silent as the asphalt in Tyson Park. Christa Pike likely still believes, in the quietest hours of her confinement, that what she did in those woods was the greatest thing she has ever done. It gave her an identity, a celebrity status, and a name that would be whispered in the dark long after she was gone. She has a tendency, perhaps, to want to go out with a bang, to remain the center of the narrative until the very end. But for the rest of the world, the story is not about her grandiosity or her wink and smile. It is about the 45 minutes of courage shown by an innocent girl from Florida who fought for her life in a strange land. As the narrator's voice remains calm and measured, we must reflect on the balance of the universe. The city of Knoxville has grown. The Job Corps Center has seen new generations of students, and the woods of Tyson Park have turned green and gold many times over since January of 1995. The story of Christa Pike is a reminder that the measured epic of our lives is often touched by shadows we cannot explain. It is a tale of a child of broken glass who became a queen of stone, and of a mother whose love became a shield for a daughter who was taken too soon. The electric chair waits in the silence of the Nashville facility, a symbol of a final reckoning that has been delayed but not denied. The state of Tennessee holds the thread, and the shears of the law are poised for the final cut. Whether it happens tomorrow or in the years to come, the wait for justice remains a steady, rhythmic pulse in the history of the South. The perfect storm that created Christa Pike has left a wake of ruin that can never be fully repaired, but it has also revealed the unyielding strength of those who stand for the truth. Colleen Slemmer is remembered, loved, and not forgotten. Her name is spoken in the Florida sun and in the Tennessee mist, a spirit of light that endures despite the 45-minute storm. And as the night deepens and the world settles into its own quiet vigil, we are left with the image of a mother waiting at the gate, holding a picture of a girl who loved to roller skate, waiting for the shadows to finally be cast out by the light of a completed justice. The story of the youngest woman on the row is a journey through the darkest corners of the human heart, a narrative of how a ball of fire can become a funeral pyre. It is a chronicle of a yawning void that sought to consume everything in its path, only to be contained by the very walls it tried to manipulate. And as the stars move across the sky and the clock in the cell continues to tick, we realize that the greatest mystery is not why evil exists, but how love can survive it. The wait continues, a long and measured silence that holds the breath of a city and the hope of a mother. The story of Christa Pike is not yet over, but the final words are already being written in the ink of the law and the blood of a persistent memory. The night is long and the mountains are tall, but the morning always comes, and with it, the resolution that fate has already promised. Good night to the hills of North Carolina, to the streets of Knoxville, and to the quiet shores of Florida. Good night to the memories of those who fought, and to the steady, unyielding patience of those who still wait for the sun to rise on a world where the ritual has finally ended. The iron doors remain closed, the current remains poised, and the voice of Colleen Slemmer continues to echo in the hearts of those who knew her, a quiet melody that the storm could never truly silence. As the final notes of this chronicle settle into the quiet air, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a great silence. The story of Christa Pike and Colleen Slemmer is more than a record of a single night in a Tennessee park. It is a journey through the labyrinth of the human condition, a map of the shadows that stretch across the landscape of our shared history. To sit with such a story is to confront the heavy reality of fate, the fragility of innocence, and the enduring, quiet power of memory. It is a narrative that asks us to look into the darkness, not to be consumed by it, but to better understand the light we must protect within ourselves and one another. Now, as the world around you grows soft and the edges of the day begin to blur, let the weight of these words release their hold. The mountains of Tennessee, the rolling hills of North Carolina, and the warm, salt-scented air of the Florida coast are all receding into the distance, becoming part of the vast, shifting geography of sleep. The iron gates and the stone walls, the courtrooms and the corridors, these are physical things bound by gravity and time. But you are moving into a realm where such things have no power. You are entering the space between breaths, where the only rhythm is the steady, slow pulse of your own heart. Imagine, if you will, the Smoky Mountains at dusk. The mist is rising from the valleys, white and thick like the breath of the earth herself. It moves with a slow, hypnotic grace, draping itself over the ancient peaks and softening the jagged edges of the world. There is no sound here, save for the occasional sigh of the wind through the hemlocks and the distant, rhythmic murmur of a hidden stream. This is a place of absolute stillness, a cathedral of nature where the struggles of gods and mortals are swallowed by the vast, unmoving presence of the earth. The light is fading from gold to violet, and then to a deep, velvety indigo. It is a transition that requires no effort, a surrender to the coming night that is as natural as the turning of a leaf. In this stillness, we can reflect on the lessons of the measured epic. We have seen how a life can be shaped by neglect, and how a spirit can be sustained by love. We have seen the consequences of an obsession that loses its way, and the resilience of a mother's devotion that refuses to be broken. These are the threads of the human loom, woven into a pattern that is sometimes beautiful and sometimes terrible. But even in the darkest parts of the tapestry, there is a logic, a reminder that we are all part of a larger story, a narrative that stretches back to the first fires and forward to the final stars. The people in our story, Christa, Colleen, May, and Kim, are now becoming figures of myth, distant and radiant in the twilight of your mind. Their voices are fading into the background hum of the universe, their faces blurring into the soft focus imagery of the dream state. You no longer need to carry the weight of their choices or the burden of their grief. Like the travelers who once found rest in the hotel on Dell Avenue, you are simply passing through, seeking a harbor where the storm cannot reach. The sign-out sheet has been completed, the doors have been locked, and the world outside is continuing its quiet, starlit vigil without you. Consider the river, perhaps the same water that flows beneath the bridges of Knoxville, moving toward the sea. It does not struggle against the stones. It simply flows around them, guided by the ancient, invisible pull of the earth. It is a movement of total surrender, a rhythmic progression that knows its destination without needing to see the path. Let your mind become like that water. Let the thoughts of the day, the worries, the plans, the echoes of the stories you have heard, be carried away by the current. They are merely leaves on the surface, drifting toward the horizon, where they will eventually vanish into the wide, peaceful expanse of the ocean. As you drift deeper, notice the quality of the silence. It is not an empty silence, but a full one. A silence rich with the potential of rest. It is the silence of the woods after the snow has fallen. The silence of a house when the fires have burned down to embers. The silence of a mountain that has watched the passing of 1,000 years. Within this silence, there is a profound safety. You are held by the steady rotation of the planet, by the predictable cycles of the moon, and by the ancient biological necessity of sleep. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go, and nothing you need to be. You are simply a presence, a spark of consciousness returning to the great, warm darkness from which all things emerge. The stories we tell are the lanterns we carry through the night. They provide us with a way to navigate the yawning void, to find meaning in the chaos and dignity in the struggle. But even the lanterns must eventually be extinguished so that the eyes can find rest. The stories have done their work. They have offered their warnings and their comforts, their tragedies and their triumphs. Now they are being set aside, placed on a high shelf in the library of your memory, where they will wait until the sun rises again. Think of the chameleon and the ball of fire. In the light of day, these are identities, roles played upon a public stage. But in the dark of sleep, all masks fall away. There is no predator and no prey. There is no judge and no defendant. There is only the quiet, breathing essence of the self, stripped of its reddish hair and its leather jackets, its names and its numbers. You are returning to the elemental state, the same chaos from which the first gods were born. Not a chaos of confusion, but a chaos of infinite, restful nothingness. It is the gap before the word is spoken, the space before the thread is spun. The stars above Tennessee are bright tonight, cold and clear, watching over the prisons and the parks, the homes and the hills. They have seen the rise and fall of empires, the birth of heroes, and the quiet passing of those whose names are never written in books. They do not judge the world they illuminate. They simply witness it with an ancient silver indifference. Let their distance be your comfort. The problems of the world are vast, but they are also small beneath the gaze of the cosmos. The perfect storm that broke over Knoxville is but a momentary ripple in the deep, slow-turning river of time. May Martinez's weight, the electric chair's silence, and the daughter's legacy, these are the final echoes. They are becoming softer now, moving into the periphery like the sound of distant thunder over the smoky mountains. The storm has passed, and the air that remains is clean and cool. You can breathe deeply now, feeling the expansion of your lungs and the soft, heavy relaxation of your limbs. Each breath is a wave, pulling you further away from the shore of the waking world. You are entering the realm of the shades, not as the deceased in Hades, but as a dreamer in the Elysian fields. Here, the meadows are always green, the winds are always soft, and the memories that remain are only the ones that bring peace. There is no guard at this gate, only the gentle invitation of the night. You are welcome here. You belong in this stillness. The narrator's voice, which has guided you through the woods and the courtrooms, is now becoming a part of the silence itself. It is no longer a teller of tales, but a rhythmic companion to your own descent. It is a heartbeat, a breath, a low vibration that signals the end of the journey. The measured epic has reached its conclusion, and the only thing that remains is the rest you have earned. Sleep is the ultimate justice. It falls upon the innocent and the guilty alike. a universal grace that demands nothing but surrender. It is the one place where the yawning void is filled with the soft fabric of dreams, and where the ball of fire is cooled by the gentle mist of the night. As you move into this space, know that you are safe. You are protected by the walls you have built and the silence you have cultivated. As we reach the final threshold, as the words dissolve into the quiet, we thank you for traveling with us through this chronicle of shadow and light. It has been a journey of the heart and the mind, a testament to the power of storytelling to navigate the most difficult paths. We hope that these words have brought you a sense of perspective, a feeling of calm, and a bridge toward the rest you seek. In the spirit of the shared hearth, of the community of listeners who gather beneath the stars, we invite you to remain a part of this circle. If these stories have offered you sanctuary, if the rhythmic pace has helped you find your way toward the quiet, consider joining us for future journeys. By subscribing to this channel, you ensure that the lanterns will always be lit when you need them, and that the measured epic will continue to unfold in the nights to come. Sharing these chronicles with others who seek the peace of the night is a gesture of kindness, a way to extend the reach of the sanctuary we have built together. Like the candy brought up a steep hill, a shared story can be a small, vital comfort in a world that is often loud and cold. But for now, the time for sharing and the time for subscribing are put aside. Those are thoughts for the morning, for the world of light and action. Now, there is only the descent. The last light has flickered out on Olympus. The last echo has faded from the woods. The story is done. The silence is yours. Rest now. Let the darkness be your blanket and the silence be your song. The journey is over and the harbor is reached. Good night. Sleep well. Thank you for your presence tonight. If this journey through the darkness helped you find the light of rest, please consider subscribing for more nightly chronicles. Sharing this sanctuary with others helps our community of dreamers grow. Until the next story begins, may your rest be deep and your dreams be kind.